Good morning. Welcome to this historic hearing of Descendants Day. Welcome to Yoorrook Justice Commission's hearing, and we have dedicated this hearing to be focused on the evidence of non-First Peoples, whose witnesses who will share their personal connection to Victorians' colonial past. We will be hearing from Elizabeth Balderstone, Peter Sharp and Dr. Katrina Kell. Their deeply personal evidence will help shed a light on key events in the colonisation of Victoria, from the first permanent European settlement in the 1830s to the destructive protection legislation of the late 1800s. I urge all Victorians to watch the hearing and to really listen deeply to the evidence. When we understand what has happened in the past and how this impacts the present, we can create a better future and have a better understanding between all Victorians. And I'd like to thank everybody who's watching online. Welcome. And acknowledge the people that come and sit in the room, and thank you for being here as well. And we value the presence of people that have been following Yoorrook since the beginning in the hearings, and some come and sit in this room every time we have a hearing. Before we commence the hearing, I would like to invite Commissioner Hunter to give a welcome to country.
Thank you, Chair. So I'd like to welcome you to my ancestral lands, the lands of the Wurundjeri, and pay homage to my ancestors and elders, to all those that come before us as Aboriginal people and told their stories, to those that continue to tell their stories. I want to acknowledge other Aboriginal people in the room. I want to acknowledge your ancestors and elders, and particularly those online. But in light of this Yoorrook Justice Commission, I want to acknowledge today's hearings of Descendants and really acknowledge traditional owners of this state and the fight that they've had to continue to seek justice. I want to acknowledge those online as well. I'd just also like to make people aware of some of the evidence today may include reference to historic events and language that people may find distressing or offensive. If you're affected by the content and would like support, please contact 13YARN on 139276 or Lifeline on 13 11 14. Today will be hard to listen to, hard to tell, and we just have to lean into that. So may Bunja watch over us as we conduct Aboriginal business, and Nungodjin.
Thank you, Commissioner Hunter. I now call on Commissioner North to make opening remarks, please.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Commissioner Hunter, for the warmth and generosity of your welcome to country. I add the Chair's welcome to those who are here today and those who are listening online to the proceedings. In earlier hearings, we heard how the lands of Victoria were stolen from First Nations people when the settlers arrived. The settlers took the land without any legal right. They had to remove First Nations people who occupied the land to make way for their sheep and other animals. We heard that when the First Nations people were in the way, they were slaughtered. 20% of the original population was massacred to make way for the unlawful seizure of the lands of the First Nations people. Parliament then passed laws to concentrate First Nations people into reserves where their lives were controlled in detail. These laws were designed to assist the elimination of First Nations people. We heard how the 1886 Half-Caste Act split up families so that those of mixed blood were forced off the reserves, which had become their homes. In this way, the laws were used to force assimilation of First Nations people as a method of elimination. The theft of land, the massacres which followed, and the legislation designed to eliminate the population of First Nation people are parts of the horror of our Victorian history. The many witnesses, especially First Nations people, told the Commission the effects of these events impact on their lives today. As Commissioners, we felt the ongoing trauma in the powerful evidence given by First Nations people to the Commission. These are the facts we heard. These are the truths we heard. But for non-Indigenous people like me, there has been silence. We did not know of the horror of our history. We did not know the harm inflicted on First Nations people. And we did not know the ongoing damage, which, as we heard, continues to this day. This Truth Commission was created with the vision of a better Victoria, a Victoria which has come to terms with its dark history. After establishing the truth of our history, this Commission is mandated to develop a shared understanding among all Victorians of the systemic injustice and intergenerational trauma flowing from our history. That requires us all to understand our dark past. Today's non-Indigenous witnesses have family links to the theft of land, the massacres, or the Half-Caste Act. They have understood the brutality of our history. They come to share that understanding. They stand as examples of the way non-Indigenous people can face the truth of our past, and by sharing, build bridges between the oppressed and those of us who have inherited the past of the oppressors. Thank you to our three witnesses today for your courage in coming forward. May you inspire others to come to the Commission to share their understanding of the injustice of our past. No longer can we in the non-Indigenous community say that we did not know. The silence is broken. The truth gives us a choice. In the words of Desmond Tutu, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner North. Thank you very much. May we have appearances, please, Council?
Thank you, Chair. Ms Fitzgerald and I appear as counsel assisting today, and I'll take the witness of Elizabeth Balderstone to commence the hearing. I'd like to thank Commissioner Hunter for her welcome and acknowledge her ancestors and the ancestors of the Wurundjeri peoples, and pay my respects to them, their elders, and their entire community. I do that as a Yuin person from the southeast coast of New South Wales. First up, we have Elizabeth Balderstone available to give evidence and to speak to her submission if we're ready to commence with that. Thank you, Chair. Elizabeth, thank you for coming today. Could you please introduce yourself to the Commissioners?
I'm Elizabeth Balderstone. I live on Gunditjmara Country, Gippsland, Eastern Victoria.
And I also invite you to respond to Commissioners.
I'd very much like to thank you for the welcome today, Commissioner Hunter, and for your powerful words, Commissioner North, because I think that sums up so much of what myself and a lot of others are wanting to say and have these stories told. to Victoria and the wider Australian community. It's a very significant moment for me as an individual and for our family to be sitting here today, this commission. And I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respect to the traditional owners of this land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. But I'd also like to acknowledge and pay respect to all the traditional owners who lived near Warrigal Creek in Gippsland, the Bratalung people of the Gunditjmara Nation, who cared for and protected the land for tens of thousands of years. They lived on that land in balance with a rich coastal environment. The Young clan in particular hunted and sheltered, raised families, celebrated, mourned, told stories, all along the banks of the creek and behind the dunes of the 90-mile beach. And I want to acknowledge and pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. I now live on this land close to the site of the Warrigal Creek massacre, which is the focus of my submission.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Elizabeth, do you undertake to tell the truth to the Yoorrook Justice Commission today? Thank you. As you mentioned, you prepared a submission for the Commission dated the 24th of August 2024, that's correct? Chair, I'd like to tender that submission, as well as at this moment, all of the documents on the tender list. So I'll tender those documents relevant to Elizabeth Balderstone, Peter Sharp and Dr. Katrina Kell.
Will be entered into our records.
Thank you, Chair. Elizabeth, as you mentioned, your submission focuses on your family's story as the most recent custodians of the Warrigal Creek massacre site. Before we discuss that story, you wrote in your submission that you were inspired to prepare the submission by Susanna Henty's appearance before the Commission. I just wanted to ask, what inspired you about her appearance to provide your submission and appear to give evidence to the Commissioners today?
I had been encouraged and thinking of and I'm wanting to do a submission, but it was when I read and watched her sort of appearance that really inspired me to sit down and write and do it, because her presentation was so powerful, so honest, so brave. And I think she led the way for people like me. It's so important that non-Indigenous Victorians are standing up and using this opportunity. I'm really grateful to the Victorian government for leading the way in Australia with truth-telling. And so it just was an obvious thing to follow Susanna's lead and speak from the point of view of my family's story and our property that we care for now, the story of that property.
Could you tell us a little bit about your own family history?
I grew up in Melbourne. I had a very privileged upbringing. I'm very grateful to have been part of a strong family and strong extended family. But I had some relatives on my side that were farming, so I did spend time on farms and in country, but I led a very typical life of the 50s and 60s growing up. I had many opportunities that I'm always grateful to.
And how did you come to visit and eventually live at Warrigal Creek?
As I say in my submission, in May 1974, just over 50 years ago, I was heading to Wilson's Promontory with university friends for a holiday and some hiking, and I happened to drop another friend off at the Warrigal Creek farming property. She was working there as a Jillaroo, and I met Alice Irving, who I later reconnected with and married. And so by a stroke, a fateful moment that day, I guess, I met Alistair. It was a terrific, wonderful moment in my life. And then life's unfolded since then, and I eventually moved full-time to Warrigal Creek in 1980.
What do you know about the Irving history associated with Warrigal Creek?
My Alistair's grandfather moved to that area from Ballarat in the late 1880s, took up some paddocks in the district, and bought and sold and lost land like a lot of early colonial settlers, and eventually accumulated a number of what are now our paddocks, and then the homestead block, which encompasses the massacre site in 1910, and moved to the property then.
You have two daughters with Alistair,
Yep.
and you've been the sole custodian of the farm after Alistair's untimely death in the late 1980s. That's right.
Both my daughters are present today, which is wonderful.
And you also now have a number of grandchildren who continue as part of the family and connected to that site.
One will be quiet.
Well, we will welcome all participation at this commission. So, in terms of the name Warrigal Creek, your submission discusses the potential origin of that name. Could you just let the commissioners stand to be the origins of the name Warrigal Creek?
Well, as I say, we're not 100% sure. It appears that the European settlement came to Gippsland and to Port Albert in 1841. The massacre happened in mid-1843, and from our research to date, the first references to that area as Warrigal Creek was in 1844. I think a lot of, the name is from the Darug people. The Warrigal is wild dog, but there are other interpretations of it, and I say we're very led by that. It has been suggested that it can also be a reference to brave warrior, and I believe the Brettalung people were defending that land as best they could under impossible odds. But we're very open to any suggestions of.
And before we get to the nature of those historical events associated with the Warrigal Creek massacre, I just wondered if you could let the commissioners know how the farm operates today, and what occurs on the land currently.
So when the Irvings, started buying areas of the farm and then the homestead area, and since 1910, the farm has grown, and then with what happens with a lot of family farms, splitting a partnership and a smaller size again now, but it is a significant size farming property. We grow fine merino wool and beef and lamb and have some irrigation. We've also, I've had a huge passion for the land care movement and focused on protecting the remnant bush on the property and the waterways and linking those with revegetation. And that's been a real priority for us, as well as the productive side of the farm, and hopefully doing that as sensitively as we can. But it is very challenging as farmers to do that.
And I can go to your submission. You've included a number of photographs of the farm. If I can go to first the photos on what is page 5 of the submission, that's at 0064. Oh. These are a number of photos, as I understand it, Elizabeth, of the farm in operation.
Yeah, well, that one clearly is a lot of sheep who've been shorn, and I guess gives a sense of the landscape as well.
Down to the photo underneath that. So this is in regards to some of your comments about land care management and sustainable operations. Your submission discusses some of the activities that have been undertaken on the farm in terms of rejuvenation of land.
And as I said, that's been a real priority for us. And we now have sort of close to 18% of the property fenced off in remnants, revegetated areas, a large area around Jack Smith Lake State Game Reserve, and recently 50 hectares have been seeded with native vegetation as part of a carbon project, which locks the land up for 25 years as well.
You can see the effects of some of those activities in the next photos on page 7. This is at 0066. So this is a photo of the creek near the homestead before fencing off, as you just mentioned, and then subsequently, if we go to the next photograph, you can see the difference between the creek prior to and after fencing off. And is that the type of changes that you've seen in a number of the parts of the property?
It definitely is. And it's been a really rewarding process we often try and picture the land, what it was like, and clearly we can't go back to that. But I think in re-establishing these corridors and waterways, preventing runoff going into creeks and waterways is all sort of balancing that hopefully healthier environment.
And something that's quite striking about your submission is that you consistently use the language of custodianship rather than ownership regarding your own relationship with the farm. And I just wanted to ask, why do you choose to use that language in particular?
I think it's used quite a lot now, and to me it's a much more comfortable way of talking about. I mean, technically I know we do own the land, the title to the land, which I acknowledge was never ceded, but our family, have come to it later. But the term custodianship really reflects, I guess, what I feel in my time being there. I want to be looking after it as well as having the, privilege and challenge of farming it. But it just sits more comfortably. And I think it's used more and more by a lot of people. There would be some that would not use it, obviously, but to us as a family, it's the right term for it. And especially given the, story behind it all, and we're only passing through, and we hope that future custodians care for it too.
Turning then to the Warrigal Creek massacre being a significant site that's part of your property, how did you come to know about the Warrigal Creek massacre?
When I was first visiting, I can't remember exactly, and clearly my understanding of it's changed and moved over these decades, but right from my early days there, it was acknowledged. There was a sort of respect to that area, but this was the mid-70s, so I think we all knew that it was significant, but just said let it sit gently, I guess. And locally, it's always been written about in histories of the Alberton Shire and the district. It's referred to a lot. So, and as I say in my submission, my late father-in-law, who was a very keen and respected historian, wrote his first piece on the property in 1974 when he would have been 65 or so. And a fifth of that article is about the massacre and what happened in those early colonial settlement days. So I think he led the way really for me and for Alistair and the rest of the family in acknowledging it. But look, I agree back then it was in a different sense to what we do now.
But it wasn't in the sense of a hidden historical story. It was,
no.
It was a well-known fact.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
in relation to not only the family that you married into, but more generally the community around it.
That's correct. Yeah, yeah, and the community, you know, in different ways, certainly have always acknowledged it.
And what do you know about the event specifically?
Well, as I say again, there's a lot of people who've written and researched in huge detail the story of what happened in 1843, but it was, as I said, only 2 years after the first European settlement of Gippsland. There were obviously issues and clashes between the traditional owners and the settlers coming in, and it culminated. There was the probable murder of Ronald McAllister, who was the nephew of a very wealthy landholder from New South Wales, Lachlan McAllister, who'd sent people down, including Angus Macmillan, to take up large tracts of land, and they were managing sending stock down to Tasmania to feed the population there, even at that point. And I think there'd been different incidents, and then after Ronald's murder, a group of settlers came together and came upon a large group of Brutalung people camped at the waterhole at Warrigal Creek, at this major bend in the creek. It's clearly an obvious spot people would have gathered, and between 60 up to 150 or more people were killed.
And if we go to the map on page 3, which is 0062, we can see it's faint, but my understanding is the red circled number 1 towards the middle top of the page.
Yes.
Is where it's understood that the massacre occurred.
That's correct. And then Peter Gardner, who's a historian from Bairnsdale, has researched and written this for 50 years at least. But his work sort of infers that the initial site was at the main bend in the creek where a big together, possibly because they'd heard there was going to be retribution for the earlier murder. But then his theory is that then there were people camped, which would only be 2-3 kilometres away down at the mouth of the creek at number 2, where it flows into Jack Smith Lake, which in that photo is a large dry lake area, but frequently is rich with bird life and has is a lovely shallow wetland area closer to the 90 Mile Beach. And then the suggestion was that there were other attacks at Gammon Creek at number 3, and then down there Woodside Beach at number 4. And it wouldn't have taken that long for people on horseback to move through that country.
And the Commission has received evidence through the Colonial Frontier Massacres project at the University of Newcastle, otherwise known as the Massacre Mapping Exercise. And they've included an entry regarding the Warrigal Creek massacre, and based on a number of historical records, and stated that there was a creation of a group called the Highland Brigade, made up of about 20 people. Is that your understanding? Yeah. And those people, in the words of Peter Gardner, went on a rampage through the district, possibly over 5 days. And as you mentioned, massacring a number of Gunai Kurnai people at 4 different locations, with, like you said, around 60 or more at the first site, and then upwards of 150 in total. Is that your understanding?
That's my understanding, and clearly I base my knowledge on people like Peter and other historians. Yep.
and Peter himself based his knowledge on evidence such as Angus McMillan's own discussions about the events with George Robinson, the first protector of Aboriginal people, Aborigines in Victoria. In terms of Angus McMillan himself, the historical evidence suggests that he, being one of the first Europeans who settled in Gippsland, helped establish and coordinate the Highland Brigade. What do you know of Angus McMillan?
He clearly was, was supposedly the first white man to reach Port Albert coming overland from the Monero. He worked for Lachlan McAllister. Again, there's a lot written about him. He was an industrious Scot that came. I know Don Watson's written powerfully about the number of Scots that came to Gippsland at that time and other places who'd been chased off their own land in Scotland with the clearances, and then repeated the story in Australia, ironically. Angus McMillan later went on to become the Protector of Aborigines in Victoria, and had a pretty mixed career when you follow it through. And clearly over time, his name's certainly been associated with Warrigal Creek massacre and others in Gippsland. There's perhaps stronger evidence that he was at other massacres. We'll never know if he 100% was at Warrigal Creek, but there were probably only 100 or so white settlers in that region at that time. So clearly, if he wasn't there, he would have known about it, as would most of the settlers. And I'm very conscious I use the word settlers, and I'm referring to European settlers in that term. Yeah.
Relatively astounding fact that he openly discussing some of these events with the first protector of Aborigines, then becomes protector of Aborigines himself. If I can then go to what's page 9 of your submission, which is 0068. This, Elizabeth, is just for your benefit, the page after the photos of.
Some paragraph, third paragraph. Do you mind reading out the third paragraph of the commission?
I have over the years felt a growing awareness of the responsibility and gravity of caring for the massacre site in the gentlest and quietest way possible, and simultaneously I'm committed to ensuring that the truth of the massacre is told and understood more widely by Gippslanders initially and by the Victorian and wider Australian community at large. Despite persistent advocacy for the truth of the massacre to be known and understood, it's only felt as though people really wanted to listen in more recent years.
How you deal with that sense of responsibility for the Warrigal Creek massacre site?
Burden, I guess, for us as a family and for me living there, to know we're caring for this site and how to do it as well as we can. I guess our approach has been to sort of, it's now totally fenced off one part of it. I mean, the area, in fact, as I write, spreads into where our sheds and homes are. We've probably learnt to sort of, well, rightly or wrongly, sort of think of it as a more compact area in one set, but we know it's right across our land. So what was your...
Oh, and just how you deal with that sense of responsibility for the site.
Look, every day I look over to the site, hope it's feeling peaceful. The weather changes the last week. We've all seen that anger in the weather, and you sort of, you feel that for the site. Then there's many days it's beautiful, it's peaceful, there's a wonderful bird life. And I hope our role is to just care for it gently and quietly. and be led by First Nation people on the traditional owners on how to look after it in any other way. And we have, over the years, connected and reached out to many Gunditjmara people in that way. And I know they're supportive of what we're doing, and but we'd always be led to how to do it differently.
And I want to ask you some questions about some of the relationships you've formed in relation to the Gunditjmara peoples soon. You mentioned in your submission that you just read out that it's only felt as though people have wanted to listen in more recent years. Why do you think people are more receptive to listening to the truth of these stories in recent years?
I think that's just been the shift in the whole Australian population, or slowly, very, very slowly. And, truth telling is so important to us, but it didn't really, up until the 80s or 90s, it was still pushed very much to the side. No one wanted to go there. And we felt that in our sort of microcosm of Warrigal Creek and its story, but you could see it across the population. And so, things like the Redfern speech, there's been powerful moments in Australia's history that have been turning points. There's been wonderful musicians and poets, and led by First Nation people. We find it hard. I can only imagine what it must feel like for our traditional owners. But I do think, my feeling is that it has shifted, thankfully, slowly.
You've been part of that shift in a variety of ways through your work over the years, including, as your submission highlights, in 2006, you were actively involved in forming the Yarram Yarram Cultural Group. Why was that group established?
It's originally, there are a group of people I was connected with and knew around the district. And in fact, and we'd often talk about this need for more truth-telling and connecting with Gunditjmara traditional owners, learning about culture and pre-European settlement. And then around that time, the Warrigal healing place, part of the Department of Justice, was being set up near Yarram at the old Wanneroo prison. And there was a really uncomfortable resistance to it in part of the community. So I guess as a group, we thought, we wanted to sort of counteract that and be a more positive force. And at that time, even, and ever since then, NAIDOC Day has been a huge thing in Yarram. And there's been great connections between local clubs, football clubs, and the Warrigal Centre. But that was the trigger early on. Yep.
And what's its main purpose today?
It's a very low-key, informal group, and we're all getting older, 20 years on. And more recently, we do connect. We used to connect more regularly. Now, when things come up or someone wants to visit Warrigal Creek, often others will come and join me in talking with people who are showing an interest in the history and the story. There's now a much stronger group called the Wellington Reconciliation Group based out of Sale, which has grown since the Voice campaign as well. But also when we had the campaign to remove or alter the Macmillan cairns, which right through Gippsland, but the Wellington Shire, there was a motion to remove them. So some of these events have sort of strengthened feeling locally. But our cultural group, they're still very important supports. And
I might, while you've mentioned some of that advocacy around name changes associated with Angus Macmillan, your submission mentions that the cultural group was part of the successful campaign to change the name of the federal electorate that was named after Angus Macmillan. But not successful in terms of removing some of those cans. Can you just describe that? The importance of why there was advocacy done on those issues.
The changing of the name of the electorate of Macmillan, which we're not actually, Sale Yarram is not part of, but there was support from us locally towards that, and a lot of us put letters or submissions in there because of the obvious connections of Macmillan with the early history of Gippsland, and that was as that was become recognised, that people sort of made that push and eventually were successful, or certainly the removal of the name Macmillan. And then in
Elizabeth, I might just get you to move your microphone a bit closer to.
Sorry. Yep. Is that better?
Yes,
yep,
thank you.
Sorry.
I know. Not at all. I know.
And then in 2020, there was a motion, as I said, to the Wellington Shire for the removal of the cairns. That there's about 20 or 30 cairns that follow Macmillan's path through Gippsland, and they wanted to remove the ones on the Wellington Shire, in the Wellington Shire. There was a lot of discussion locally in the media on this, but and it looked like the motion might get up, but the final vote, it lost. It was all online. It was during COVID, and that was upsetting, and it's still ongoing, that campaign. And I think in time, at least, there will be truth-telling plaques. But Gippsland is a conservative community, and
why do you think there is that resistance amongst the community to removing such memorialisations?
There's a strong feeling that European settlement history is what the focus has been. A lot of families, individuals have strong connections with those stories, and are not comfortable with them being questioned or altered in any way or challenged, and just a resistance to that move to truth-telling, I think, and it's a slow process.
How does that make you feel? You know, when you say that about, you know, given your growth as a person and your knowledge and you know, of the massacre side and the things that actually happen, these are facts. So how, like, you know, when these things happen, or you continually hear pushback from society, or living in a conservative area, how does or hearing conservative views all the time, how does that sit with you and feel, you know, even?
It's hard, and I have to navigate it sometime. I mean, I'm part of the farming community there, and I understand other people see things very differently. I'm not shy to speak up, and my views are known, but I'm probably guilty of not waving, you know, not pushing it all the time. I think people respect that I feel differently, as do others. I wrote to the local Gippsland Times after that vote, and I invited the councillors to come and sit quietly by the creek and reflect on that vote and what had happened. And I was also really conscious that Grattan Mullet and others who'd come to speak on behalf of the Gunai Kurnai that night, if I felt so shattered by that vote, how did they feel driving back to Bairnsdale? And I try and say that. I mean, I think it's hopefully a generational thing too, and I do know that some of the younger members of families that have been pretty conservative on all this, there's a shift, but it's going to take time.
With the invitation to come and just sit at the side and be, you know, engaged in it and feel it, how many of them took that opportunity up?
A couple did, and maybe with COVID and things at the time, I probably should have pushed it further, and those times go. But it's certainly a couple were happy to, and a couple have visited over time. So, yeah. Mm.
You've mentioned a number of times through your journey of learning more about Warrigal Creek, and the traditional owners of that place, that you've formed a number of significant relationships with Gunai Kurnai traditional owners, and your submission also goes through that. Particularly people like Uncle Albert Mullet, Uncle Russell Mullet, Auntie Marjorie Thorpe, a number of the Thorpes and Youngs and Pattons. How important are those relationships to you?
They've been incredibly important for me to have that chance to connect and break down that bridge that often seems to be, between non-Indigenous and Indigenous Australians. And I guess early on it was late Uncle Albert Mullet was fantastic to me. We became mates, I guess, and he would call in occasionally when he was driving through to the prom or whatever. And when we met with the instructing committee, the Gunai Kurnai people, a few of us went down to a meeting, and that would be in about 2006 or 7. I remember him saying he felt this was the first time that, a mob of white fellas had come to talk openly. He sort of, I think, sensed my keenness and willingness to connect and get these things talked about and recognised. And I'll be eternally grateful to that friendship. And likewise, Uncle Russell Mullet, I met many years ago when my girls were little. He visited with my father-in-law, and he's, a great friend and strength now. Yep.
Some of the key things you've learned about the area, and particularly about the Warrigal Creek massacre site from those traditional owners?
I'm very respectful that for some it's a really difficult place, or they'd prefer not to visit, and I would never question that. And the same for non-Indigenous Australians. I'm sure it's a very powerful place. I think both Uncle Albert and Uncle Russell and others like Richard Young, they expressed a gratefulness that we're looking after it gently and quietly and protecting the site, and willing to invite people there and to talk about it. So I'm so grateful for that.
And you mention in your submission that you attended the consent determination where the native title of the Gunai Kurnai was formally recognised, and you write in your submission that it was an unforgettable day and a true privilege to be present. I have a suspicion that someone else might have been there in attendance here today. But the relationship between property owners in a Western sense, particularly farmers and traditional owners, has not always been a happy one. What do you think makes your relationship different?
Well, I'm still very aware at the end of the day, I'm still a property owner and living on unceded land and farming unceded land. But I also sense we've got to meet together on some of it, and that, that there is a mutual respect, and I've been lucky to build that. And it's just, for me, it's an obvious thing to be open and to reach out and navigate the way forward, as we all try and do in Australia, I guess. And really that day at Stratford, in a huge marquee at the Knob Reserve, is unforgettable to me. It was a very powerful day, and it was a huge privilege to be asked along, be a witness to it too.
The important theme of your submission is about educating the general public about the site, and more generally about the history of interactions between First Nations and European settlers. And in particular, in regards to the site, you've mentioned the work of authors such as Peter Gardner, who we've discussed, and Don Watson, all the way up until the recent creation of a documentary on the massacre by Andrew Dodd, Lisa Guy, and students from Swinburne University. Why are these efforts important to you?
Well, each of them from that, the story gets out further. And, Don's book, well, I wish more people could read that. It's still a fantastic book written in 1984. The documentary was like a gift to us because they wanted to tell the truth of that story and in a format that could be seen by a much wider audience. And, I guess we were sort of battling away in our little circle, but we needed those skills and that network and that expertise to take it out further. So that was a really strong moment, and the film was shown in a number of communities and places and is still available.
And you've mentioned that at times over the decades, the local Yarram Secondary College has had teachers who you've said are brave enough to teach the truth of local history and even conducted excursions to the site, and that you hope going forward that truth-telling becomes part of the national curriculum. What would you like to be seen to be done more to educate people about the Warrigal Creek massacre site itself, but more generally about that history?
Well, that to me is one of the big, huge opportunities and answers to sort of change our curriculum and have that truth of settlement and the stories that go with it. And I think on a local basis in Gippsland, having examples for students to study, photograph, paint is a really important way of teaching that stays with them. And it's been a while since anyone from Yarram Secondary College has brought a group out, but I know often I'll meet people in their 30s and 40s now who remember that learning and those visits. And that really strikes me as how symbolic that was for them. And I think and I know the Commission is pushing greatly. And I think it's changing within curriculum.
But with the curriculum, so you're saying not many have come out lately, so it's really dependent on individual teachers.
Yes, exactly.
So there is nothing within the education system or the school that actually goes there. It just relies on individual teachers who are motivated and then do something.
I think so. And the most recent approach I had was from a teacher who'd grown up in the district and knew the story and about bringing a group out from Sale. So, yeah, it does depend on that. So it's actually not written in the curriculum yet, is it? I suppose you're saying.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
So on 2024, still relying on
Knowing.
it rather than having it part of the.
Yeah. Yeah, you're correct. And I think through the documentary, when that was screened locally, in fact, the first screening, we chose a sort of venue we thought would have enough people there. We had to do 2 screenings, and then subsequently have had some really large screenings in places like Yarram, and the schools have been involved with that too. I know Lisa and Andrew feel it's a tough documentary, and I still find it tough to watch, that it should be in a supported sort of way, watched not alone on the couch, but within schools, that's a really good tool, I'm sure.
In terms of some of those education around truth-telling, your submission also talks about renaming of sites and renaming of locations, and even you've done some research and discussed with traditional owners even renaming of certain parts of your own property. Why is that particularly important to you?
I think using the traditional names is really important, and it's wonderful seeing it happening across Victoria in different ways, in Australia and the ABC now. I mean, I think we all need to change our language and interpretation. And Warrigal Creek it hasn't, no one ever quite knows why, but it's not even correctly named on the South Gippsland Highway. It's called 4 Mile Creek, which is where it was like they didn't really want to recognise it then, but with Glawak and our local groups, we are hoping to change that and use the traditional name as well. But I think throughout Gippsland, there's huge opportunity within that. And I know local shires like Wellington Shire itself, but they're trying, but it's very slow.
I want to talk about protection of the site itself and some of your evidence in your submission in regards to the actual site. If we can go to the final page of the submission. And this is first a photo of the main massacre site from the homestead in 1980. That's right.
Yep, that's correct. Yep.
You can see quite a striking difference if we look at the same view in 2024 in the next photo. And so could you just explain to the commissioners what's happened to change the nature of the site in that time and why that's been done?
So the site has been fenced off. In that early one, there were probably occasionally stock grazing to the creek edge. It was in an area because it's close to the buildings. It wasn't sort of part of a big paddock, but it was grazed on both sides of the creek. So on the northern side, it belongs to neighbours of ours who know about my submission, very supportive too. But over in the late 80s, early 90s, we fenced that area off. So it's just naturally regenerated basically. And there's only native wildlife, no sheep, cattle, horses. And it's peaceful, I guess, for that respect. We don't even actually go in there a lot unless there's people wanting to visit or doing some sort of weed management and necessary protection of the site.
Can I just ask, is that border onto another property, that side?
Yeah, so on the northern, our side of the creek is to the south and the northern side of the creek belongs to our neighbours.
And what, you just said that your neighbours support?
Yep, so they've fenced and protected the site and have a full understanding of it, maybe in a quieter way than I do. I'm not. They certainly they've seen the submission and are, supportive of what they know. I'm here today. Yeah, and they have protected it. They don't let any. They respect that.
Can I ask, how did you approach that conversation with them around, helping protect the area?
I guess we'd done some of our work and we were very involved with land care and fencing all our creek areas, and they witnessed that and have come on board through land care too in protecting those sites. Yeah.
You had some conversations with them as well about kind of
yes.
knowledge of the area and
and they're certainly, and they came along when the documentary premiered in Gippsland, so they're certainly very aware of the significance of the site too. Yeah, they we sort of own our farms either side of theirs. They have one area that comes straight down onto them. Bend in the creek.
I think I'm just listening so far. The relationship that you've built with traditional owners, particularly the mob from Gunditjmara, has been quite a positive thing. And I think a lot of the time we hear evidence before the commission, and as Aboriginal people living here in Victoria, that particularly around sacred objects on farms and stuff like that, particularly farmers, are unwilling to come forward because they're worried about different things happening and so forth, but your experience seems to be quite different around a positive experience with traditional owners.
It certainly is, and when we've had occasional field days in the past, part of land care or farming projects, probably only one, but Auntie Marjorie Thorpe came and did a welcome to the farmers there. That probably doesn't happen a lot, but it meant a lot to me. She did. We've had other days, and Uncle Lloyd's come, and we do have a collection of axes and stones that have been picked up over many years, and they're kept, and they're still in the homestead, and then I know they're there and are happy they're kept sort of on country for now, but we're very much led on that too.
I suppose the sentiment I'm trying to see here is like, there's not what there's nothing to worry about.
No, and that's probably partly why one of my hopes from today is that other landholders let go that angst of worrying that land will be resumed or impacts on what they're wanting to do. I mean, it's a shared journey, and I hope that others will see that.
To build on Commissioner Lovett's questions, you state expressly in your submission that whatever happens at the site or at sites of tragedy like Warrigal Creek must be determined and led by traditional owners, but at the same time you strongly believe non-Aboriginal Australians need to learn and reflect on those tragedies and wrongs of the history. Why is it important for you that any activity you do in relation to the site be led by traditional owners?
Well, I feel like it's such a sacred, special site of significance that it's important we're led by the traditional owners. I don't want to feel that particular area. We as a family would rather they led any activities, management plans, that we worked on it together. It's terribly important to me.
And you've explored some options, and you discussed this in your submission about exploring handing land back to traditional owners, joint management arrangements for particular sites. Can you just tell the commissioners a bit more about your hopes for the future in that regard?
Yep, we've looked deeply at handing back this main area here, and it's tricky because of access and its proximity, and that fence is there in the bottom of the photo, but it clearly spreads out a lot further, and that's the site where the homestead was built, the woolshed, a lot of the infrastructure of the property is in that area, so there's a practical complexity there. And I have talked with Uncle Russell especially about it a lot lately, and maybe a joint management agreement that we can be led and united on is a sort of easy option for now anyway. But I feel, and I know the girls shared this, we want to make sure it's permanently protected and looked after, and that's the most important thing to us. There's things like cultural covenants. New South Wales have Aboriginal places that are named on non-traditional owner country. So we're really exploring that. Opposite to that, there are the area sort of at the mouth of the creek where Warrigal Creek splits and flows into Jack Smith Lake, and it's often a dry drainage. They're not big creek entrances or anything, but there's an area which was number 2 on that original map. And there's an area around that we would, as a family, be very happy to hand back to traditional ownership if that was a requested and wanted process.
Can I just ask on those properties and the handing back, and like you've come here to truth tell, it's talking massacre sites, and I'm just wondering about ancestral remains on any of those sites and what has happened if you've come across those.
Not in my time, and we haven't. And I suppose that's one of, occasionally people say, why can't we investigate, there's been discussion of really solving the mystery once for all. But that would be totally up to traditional owners. And given it's such a sacred, it's a site. I guess I understand that no one would want to disturb it. And so that's what's important to us, that it is protected and undisturbed. Does that answer that?
Yeah, it
Yep.
does. It's just a question of,
Okay.
we've got these sites, and on the Lyndall Rhines massacre maps,
Yep.
it does talk about remains have been found at each of these sites on several occasions. So I was just wondering, have in your time or
Going back further, and I reread that, and I'm not, 100% sure on the detail of that. I probably
Yeah.
should be, but it certainly down near the mouth of the creek, and I'm sure if there was investigation that could happen, but
Commission also talks about cleanups that have happened along the way, including just before George Augustus
Yeah.
Robinson came through,
Yep.
so that those who committed these massacres were well aware that they needed to remove evidence.
Yes, and they supposedly did that and took the evidence, and it's buried in a sort of low hill on Jack Smith Lake called Red Hill, that's fenced and revegetated and protected, I guess, in lots of ways. But if more people start to come or investigate, it's a risk, isn't it? It's a pretty open access area.
just with yourself having those relationships that Commissioner Lovett was talking about, you would have a way and means of contacting the traditional owners about if you did come across.
Yes, certainly. We certainly would. And look, during, we've had some pretty significant droughts, the water hole dropped significantly, and there's certainly been, stones, axes, but we've left them in place, and we wouldn't disturb anything now.
The aspiration around joint management or transferring some of the land back, noting the complexities you've spoken about, is really derived from your own accord, not from pressure from traditional owners?
No pressure at all. And I mean, to anyone, it's only a token. It's a token, really. I'm the first to admit that. But if it was wanted, we would be very keen to pursue that. And in the meantime, we'd really like to process this secure joint management, so it's on title or whatever is needed. I think is a real priority for us going forward. Yeah, especially of this sort of main site, but all the sites. At the moment, the mouth where the creeks sort of flow into Jack Smith Lake, that's all part of a covenanted area and outside of grazing area. So the waterways are fenced and protected.
Just a final series of questions, and I say that to foreshadow in case the commissioners have any questions of their own. And importantly, to maintain my gold star for finishing on time. Elizabeth, that's extremely important in this commission. You state in your submission that you have had a long-held belief that we all have a responsibility to investigate, confront and share our truths as non-Indigenous Australians, and that you hope you sharing your story will encourage other non-Aboriginal Victorians to come forward and share their stories. Why is that important to you?
I think because I've been living, and it's such a part of our journey that, and I don't, unless Australia as a whole confronts this past and shares it and teaches and tries to understand what happened in those early years, we're never going to go forward as a nation in partnership with our First Nation people. So it's incredibly important. We've seen it overseas. You referred to Desmond Tutu. I mean, across the world, not telling the truth is never going to get any of us anywhere, and it's going to sort of halt things and stall things. And to me, I just hope maybe even if it's only one or two others are willing to start sharing their stories, that can be some healing and some recognition and enabling us to go forward.
And You mentioned this at the start of your evidence and also in your submission that sense of responsibility you feel also is a heavy burden sometimes. Do you mind expanding on why that is?
I think both Mike, Alice and Kirsty would agree, it is a heavy burden to care for this site in the best way we can, and hope we're doing it well enough and open always to the true owners of those sites and the people that have, ancestors buried there in tragic circumstances. And it's such a grim part of Australia's history that it is a burden to know we're the ones looking after it. And sometimes it does feel pretty lonely, and we would, I've had enormous support, but we would hate to ever know that something could disturb or challenge all that. Yeah. And I think, I've written too that as a nation, being really honest about our whole development in those early decades is vital.
Notwithstanding that heavy burden, your submission ends on a positive note, whereby you state that you feel the sands are beginning to shift and that you regularly remind yourself to listen deeply, and that we are on a shared journey. What would you say to non-Aboriginal Victorians who might be watching or reading a news article about this evidence and other evidence that we'll hear today? What would you say to them to encourage them to explore their family histories and the history of the land they're connected to, as confronting as it might be, despite that heavy burden you've talked about?
I think we've all got a duty to do it as Victorians and Australians, to look at where we live, investigate the story of European colonisation, think about what it meant for the people that were there and what happened and what's happened to the landscape, and acknowledge that story, and then also the benefits so many of us have had because of that tragic beginning to Australia. And I just hope as a nation we can share those benefits. And
further questions?
Just like to ask one thing, and thank you so much for your evidence. Do you ever, the massacre is not that long ago, and I wondered whether you ever reflected on the fact that there are Gunai Kurnai people around now who will trace their ancestry to the people that were murdered on your place.
we do often. I think we've had certainly a couple of people who visited who do have a connection back, but not a lot. And I'm really mindful of it. It's not, when I went there in 74, it was only 130 years earlier. It's a very short time period. So I do feel very conscious of that. And in that first 10 years or so of settlement, the population went from, 1,000 plus in our area to less than 100, I think. It's tragic. And they're the figures we need to acknowledge. And but that's so true. I do think of that, I think. And I know there's others who've told me they would find it hard to go there, and I totally respect that too.
Just in the opening statement here, I just want to read a sentence to you and then ask a question. It says here, I am sure the tragedy and trajectory of the frontier wars and ongoing dispossession overlay so much of the challenges and inequities faced by First Nations peoples every day. Do you want to kind of elaborate on, a lot of people will go, well, why are Aboriginal people overrepresented in the criminal justice system, the child protection system and so forth, and many other, negative things about Aboriginal people? You've made the parallel between, early happenings, to use the words lightly today, given the content,
Yep.
around the traumatic things that happened to our people, to why so many of our people are in the situation they are in today. Can you elaborate any further on that?
I think it's, if the truth of your past is not understood and acknowledged or interpreted totally differently, when Aboriginal people have had to grow up being told, you know, the land wasn't theirs, they didn't, you know, that the way they lived for those tens of thousands of years right through Australia was really just pushed aside and buried for so long. And I can't imagine as an individual to have a chunk of your past being obliterated or denied. And that affects anyone's sort of well-being, positiveness about life in their future and a future for their family, if you can't have your whole story recognised honestly and truthfully.
And you've
Did
had,
I answer it enough? I'm not sure.
that's okay. That's okay. It's your evidence here. And you had your family here today. You have your family here today, and a little one has been
In and out.
sharing some. I guess, but I mean, I guess where I'm trying to get to with this is that I feel that the ancestors have sent a message through to the little one today about crying for country.
Mm-hmm.
Crying for country around, we're talking about really deep traumatic things here. And I think that, as I said, the ancestors are sending a message through your grandchild to sort of express here today in their own words about crying for country, and, you know, and just making sure that we're keeping you know, the stories at the forefront of people's minds, because this is facts we're dealing with here.
Yep.
This is not just some anecdotal things that that you've decided to come here and share today. It's some feelings.
Mm.
It's really important that we continue to remind all Victorians and all Australians that, you know, we are documenting the true history of what happened to our people here.
Yep.
Here in Victoria as well. So just wanted to also, you know, thank you for showing leadership as well in the community. And in society, it's tough to be able to be at the forefront around having conversations, particularly around anything to do with our people, and whether it be massacre sites or whether it be just trying to actually right the wrongs of the past as well. And I know that a lot of trauma comes to people who also put their hands up or grab the fence and look above. So I just appreciate you coming here today and sharing the truth of you know, what's the site is and what it was and what it continues to be, and also proactively working with traditional owners, particularly Gunai Kurnai, on what the next steps might be, noting there's some complexities involved in that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd also like to thank you very much, Elizabeth. I didn't know what to expect today, and it's one thing to read the written word. It's just cold, stark facts, but to hear you speak about changing attitudes, the manner and dignity with which you have spoken to us, and the respect you show for our people and TOs is very important. That can only be for the good. It's and of course, there are benefits for all around if we can have harmonious communications. Our well-being and mental health is the better for it. I note you make a comment about the dawn service and Australia Day and a lack of recognition of frontier wars. I mean, I think, and the mention of, you know, crying for country, these are things that we feel deeply.
Mm-hmm.
And you get triggered sometimes by a place or a conversation or a person who's associated with something like that. And I really appreciate your insights and your understanding to some extent about how we can feel, because clearly you treasure what you've got for the future, not just for now, but for the future. And so I thank you very much for your contribution today, and I hope other people are listening and take note, because it's a big story and it's our story collectively.
Thank you. And I would encourage any Victorian to go to a dawn service on Australia Day, hopefully on a different date, but the power of what's growing in those ways is enormous.
Thank you so much. Shall we?
Yeah, adjourn until 11:45.
11:45. Thank you, Council.
Goodwin, I don't know if you know the new rule that there's a penalty.
Thank you, Chair. If the Commission pleases, I now call today's second witness, Peter Sharp. Mr. Sharp, will you state your name for the Commissioners?
My name is Peter Sharp.
And do you undertake to give truthful evidence to the Yoorrook Justice Commission today?
I certainly do. To the best of my knowledge, it is the truth, but if it's based on the evidence as I've found it, if it's other evidence is brought forward to challenge it, it may, yeah, I do my best based on the evidence I've found.
And you caveat what you say in that way because you're not a historian. The evidence you're giving today is your personal reflections based on your own research. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
You've also prepared a statement for the Commission. To the best of your knowledge, are the contents of that statement true and correct?
To the best of my knowledge, yes.
That statement will be tendered as part of your evidence, Mr. Sharp. Now, you've prepared an opening statement for the Commissioners. Would you like to read that statement now?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Burke. Your words at the Lake Biolake Festival this year encouraged me to make this submission. Thank you, Commissioner North, for your words this morning. I think they were very, very pertinent. And seeing you mention Bishop Desmond Tutu, he has been a great inspiration to me, and I did once have the privilege of sitting actually closer to him than I am to you now, because I was late arriving at the church in Geelong, and the only space left was literally on the floor at his feet when he was in the pulpit. Thank you, Commissioner Hunter, for your welcome to country. I have lived and worked for most of my life on the lands of the Kulin Nation, in particular Wurundjeri, Bunurong and Warrarung land. I acknowledge that these lands have been and are still cared for since time immemorial by the Kulin, were taken from them by force and never ceded. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future, and to the elders of all First Nations throughout this continent and its islands. And I pay my respect in particular to an elder from Warrigal Country where I live, Melinda Kennedy, who's with us today. As I grew into adulthood on these lands, I slowly became aware of the lies and cover-ups at worst, and pretences and paternalism at best that pervaded the culture. The culture I had been brought into. But beside the growing awareness was a sense of not knowing what action to take without becoming a further part of the privileged paternalism. I always believed or guessed that dispossession of First Peoples after the invasion must have involved massacres, even though it was denied. It came as a shock to learn that the attempted elimination continued after frontier violence diminished. And I say diminished because it really probably hasn't ended. It was a greater shock when I stumbled on the evidence that indicated that a member of my own family had enabled the attempted elimination to be put into law. The frontier violence can be claimed to be outside the law, but what I saw was something that wasn't just legal and within the law, it was the law. I knew then that there was something I could do and that I had no option but to do it, and that was to tell the truth. I wish to present that evidence today and tell what I believe to be the truth. In the course of doing so, I will, in quoting sources and in discussion, use terms in the racist language of the time. I do not intend any offence through use of this language, but consider its use inevitable and important in the accurate presentation of the source material. To all those viewing who themselves or whose families have been and still are being impacted by the introduction of laws and policies in which a member of my family played such a significant role, I say that I am personally profoundly sorry.
Mr. Sharp, you are a descendant of Australia's second Prime Minister, Alfred Deakin?
Yes, but please call me Peter.
Peter. Could you explain that connection to us?
Alfred Deakin was my mother's maternal grandfather, so my mother's mother's father.
And can you tell us what you were told within your family about Deakin as a Prime Minister?
As a Prime Minister, not very much. That was, I didn't really know much, but wasn't talked much about his actual politics in my growing up. But as I've written in my statement, my grandmother gave me the 1965 biography by John Larno's for must have been my 18th or 21st birthday. I didn't race immediately to read it. It's pretty heavy going. I did, I think, in due course, when I was probably in my mid-20s, slog my way through it. And when I reopened it again in recent years, in doing the research I've done, I came across a page of handwritten notes that I'd left in it, where I noted highlighted, the only highlighted note in all the notes I took was that Larno says something like, I'm paraphrasing it, viewed in the strictest terms, Deakin would have to be described as a British racist. So I did have that obviously disturbed me slightly then, but it was nothing further than that. In those it's a 2-volume biography, and in the entire 2 volumes, the words Aborigine or Aboriginal or any other reference to First Nations people does not occur.
And just going back to growing up, and you had an awareness that Alfred Deakin was a Prime Minister of Australia.
Oh, yes.
And it sounds as though not much about his politics was discussed within the family. What were you told within your family about Deakin as a man?
Well, the first mention of him was by my grandmother. and she was describing him as her father and in very fond terms. She said he was a wonderful, wonderful man, wonderful father, storyteller, playful. I never heard her say anything but kind words about him.
And what have you subsequently learned through your own research about Deakin as a politician?
Well, before I say about a politician, I did meet, there's another biographer of Deakin, Al Gabay, who did a PhD in the 1990s, published title is The Mystic Life of Alfred Deakin, which tells a great deal about Deakin's inner thinking. It's based on all his notes, his papers in the National Library are said to be the largest single personal collection, but they were never meant to be found. He developed early onset dementia and did not destroy them. And Al Gabay, when he was writing that biography in the 1990s, said to me, it's a great pity there's no one else living outside the family anyone who had a personal memory of Deakin. And I took him, I said, I think there is, and I took him to meet an then elderly, very elderly woman who had been a school days friend of my grandmother's. And her description of Deakin was, as an outsider, her first words were, "Oh, temperamental, my dear, temperamental." And she described him throwing a glass of water in one of his daughter's faces because she was wearing lipstick to go down the street, which is a very, very different side, reveals a very, very different side to the description of Deakin that is most known, which is affable Alfred.
And after that engagement with the school friend of your grandmother's, what have you subsequently learned through your own research about Prime Minister Alfred Deakin?
The simplest way to put it is he was an extremely complex man, extremely, and I think there will be many further examinations of his personality and what drove him. Now, one of the things that came out in Gabay's biography is his incredible belief in higher powers, spiritualism, and his own belief that he had been chosen for a divine destiny. And even that he was prepared to sacrifice himself for this cause, which he said was his race, the ideal of the Anglo-Saxon race to have exclusive occupation of this continent. And that he was prepared, in his writings, there is evidence that he says he was prepared to sacrifice himself for this cause, and even that it meant, now most martyrs who sacrifice themselves for a cause think they might go to a higher place. He said, he wrote, there is evidence that he says, I'm prepared to go to a lower place for my cause. So, and there's other pieces in his writing which reveal that he, beneath this affable appearance of affable, he was prepared to be absolutely ruthless, and especially if he could get away with it. Well,
In your view, what were the practical consequences of these spiritual beliefs in him having a divine destiny that was related to racial issues in Australia?
well, I think that he was prepared to do whatever it takes to achieve what he believed was his mission.
And in terms of the research that you've done, what did he do to achieve that mission, in your view?
I believe that and it's a very complex story, because I believe that in his younger days, he was, and I've written this in my submission, that he, aged at about 6, rather than going to school, he walked in the opposite direction and went and joined a group of, it's to be presumed, Bunurong in what is now Fawkner Park. But he saw them disappear. Now, as a 6-year-old, that's a very formative, we believe what we see and when we're that age, and we believe what adults tell us. And he was told the Aboriginal people are a dying race. And I think that you have to credit him with a certain innocence in growing up, in that that's what he was told. And he was in this, there was nothing at that time as he was growing up in the 1860s, there was really not another place on the planet like Melbourne, with the wealth of the gold rushes, and the buildings were just, it was extraordinary. And you have to accept that he grew up with this vision before him that this land was going to be occupied solely by the invading race. And let's not beat around the bush. I think it was an invasion. And the Anglo-Saxon people that he felt were his cause don't have any qualms about talking about the Norman conquest. They don't talk about the Norman settlers who arrived in England in 1066. They say the Norman conquest and William the Conqueror. So let's talk about the invasion. But after he entered politics, and he entered at the age 22, I think there's evidence that he was possibly Australia's first career politician, and it was only possible by that time because prior to that, politicians didn't receive salaries, so they had to have independent means. And so they were the wealthy elite that entered politics. But and that's all he ever did as far as his major occupation was from the age 22 was as a politician. And even in so he entered politics in 1880, and I think that still the evidence is that in 1882 I think that he still believed, and he still believed that the numbers of Aboriginal people in Victoria were in decline. There's a letter from the Board of Protection for the Board of Protection for the Aborigines in Victoria to the Chief Secretary of Victoria, which position Deakin later achieved. But I can't remember who was the Chief Secretary in 1879. There's a letter from the Board of Protection to the Chief Secretary saying it's with great regret that we to report that the numbers of Aborigines in Victoria is rapidly declining. And there was a lot of disease. There was a flu epidemic in Victoria in 1881, which killed 10% of the entire population of Victoria and 20% of the Indigenous population. So the numbers were very much still in decline when he entered politics. But I think a time comes somewhere around 1882 or 83 where the reports are, and they'd be both in the reports from the Board of Protection and reported in the papers, that the numbers were now increasing, particularly of the mixed heritage population, partly because they may have had more resistance to disease.
And in the research you've done, it's indicated that Deakin had a role in some amendments that then redefined Aboriginality. Can you discuss those amendments?
Well, yes. And there's it was to a certain extent fortuitous that so the Board of Protection in 1884 wrote a one-page request to and here it is. That's from this I found in the Public Records Office in North Melbourne. This is a one-page request from the Board of Protection, requesting some amendments to the existing 1869 Act for the Protection and Management of Aborigines in Victoria. And from they made this request to the then Chief Secretary, Graham Berry, and for 2 years, from May 1884 to the day Graham Berry resigned from Parliament in December 1885, he consistently, each time the Board of Protection wrote to him requesting, saying, have you done anything about this? He wrote back to them saying, oh yes, I've had a look at it. And then each time I think he just put it back in the drawer. And he hadn't told a lie. He'd had a look at it and he put it back in the drawer. And so for 2 years he did nothing, except during that time he actually gazetted Corranderk to be a permanent reserve, an indication that he was which was against the Board of Protection's wishes. So my inference, and this is my inference from the evidence, is that Berry had concerns about these requests, and we probably haven't got time to go into all the details of it, and then after Berry resigned at the end of 1885, there was an election in March or February, 5th of March 1886, in which and several other ministers had resigned, so there was an election. And as a result of that election, Deakin, in a coalition government with Duncan Gillies, a Conservative, Deakin the leader of the Liberals, Deakin became Chief Secretary. And the importance of being Chief Secretary was that the Chief Secretary was ex officio chairman of the Board of Protection and with ministerial responsibility for Aboriginal policy. And there was no other, it's important to recognise that the Board of Protection had no executive power. They were prominent citizens appointed by the governor to be on this board. But all they could do was make requests like this. They could not pass legislation. only the Chief Secretary could direct that legislation be drawn up, and only the Chief Secretary could introduce it to Parliament. Only Parliament could pass it, but only the Chief Secretary could direct that the legislation be and directed through the Parliament.
So at this time, what did Deakin do?
Well, the outcome of the 1886 of the amendment was, and in contrast to what Berry's prevarication over 2 years, so the election was on the 5th of March when Deakin was elected and took the role of Chief Secretary. By the 29th of March, from the evidence I've found in the draft documents in the Public Records Office, before the end of March, Deakin had directed the Chief Legal Counsel, Edward Guinness, to begin the process of drafting the amendment to the Act. And this is the first handwritten draft of the 1886 amendment, later to become known as the Half-Caste Act. It's drafted, the handwriting, I think, is in the handwriting of J.A. John Aloysius Gurner, the parliamentary draftsman. And then there's a series of drafts drawn up between March and May 1886. So in total contrast, there's a flurry of activity. Deakin has directed to get this through. And then on the 23rd of June 1886, he tabled this amendment. And in the Hansard, he tables it without making any comment on it.
Will you explain to the commissioners, in its final form as passed, what that amendment did practically?
The most important, the real crux of it, was that it redefined those who were recognised as Aboriginal in the state of Victoria. The 1886 Act begins, it says, all Aboriginal natives of Victoria and all Aboriginal half-castes shall be deemed Aboriginal. By the time the amendment was passed, and there's a long story in between, but by the time it was passed, the amendment changed the Act to say that only Aboriginal natives of Victoria, that is, in the language of the time, the full-bloods, were deemed Aboriginal. Anyone of mixed heritage could no longer claim Aboriginality, and in fact were defined as half-castes. Not even Aboriginal half-castes, half-castes. So what that meant, and this is the critical thing for Deakin, I think, was that on the signing of that, when the governor signed that legislation into law, it was possible to say that it wasn't immediate because there was a sort of lag period, an amnesty period, but within 7 years, it would be possible to say that the Aboriginal population of Victoria was half what it had been in 1886, and that it was going to continue to decline because it was true that the full-blood population, to use the language of the time, was diminishing. And that was crucial to Deakin's premise that the Aboriginal people were dying out, and one day it was going to be possible to say this continent is, and he later wrote this, that one day he wrote in 1905, he wrote, in 100 years' time, in all probability, there will not be a coloured skin or a trace of, or a hint of colour in the population of Australia.
So that difference in numbers, admittedly, it took place over perhaps 7 years. Would it be fair to say that they're essentially, through the law, the Aboriginal, a huge chunk of the Aboriginal community were essentially defined out of existence by the definitions in the law?
Yes, exactly. There's a lot of writing where people have written the treatment of Aboriginal people of mixed heritage was different, and they claim that that's all the 1886 Act did. That's not what it actually redefined them. It took away their Aboriginality, and of course that meant that their treatment was different.
And will you just explain what you understand to be the difference in treatment, in particular, who was allowed to live on reserves and what it meant, what you've learnt it meant for families living on reserves, and any other impacts you're aware of?
Well, I think it's well known what, and I think that's what all those families who were impacted by it have told that story pretty well. It was devastating because it was, I mean, there's so much more to tell here, because it wasn't just that they were disallowed to stay on the reserves where their family ties could remain strong and kinship could be preserved, language could be preserved. They were forced to disperse, and the policy of removal of children came into being, and it was the beginning of the stolen generations. And Professor Richard Broome, who's been a witness at the Commission, has written that he has actually said that the terms, the request from the Border Protection in 1884 does not qualify under the 1948 United Nations definition of genocide. This does not qualify as proposed as genocide, whereas the bill that was passed in Parliament at the end of 1886, having been directed by the Chief Secretary, Alfred Deakin, does qualify as leading as
A genocidal, the outcome being?
as is, because it satisfies the cultural destruction of culture, but also removal of children from one group, and I can't remember the term, can't quote the actual terms of the definition, but removal of children from one cultural group to another by force. And that's one of the crucial things is this, the request from the Board of Protections did not have enforcement in it. The actual wording is that that from the 1st of January 1885, all able-bodied half-castes now on the stations under the age of 35 years should be told to look out for employment or seek settlement elsewhere. So they were being told, they were being encouraged, is the terms of this. By the time the legislation passed, they were no longer even able-bodied half-castes. They were just half-castes, and they were not eligible to be counted as Aborigines and Aboriginal. Sorry, the language of the time. By the time the legislation was passed, they were no longer Aboriginal, and they were forced off the reserves, not just encouraged, forced. And that's the change. That's what Richard Broome identified, saying, well, the coercion, the force, and the removal of children defines it as attempted genocide under the 1948 Act.
Before we go any further, I wanted to ask you another question about the board, but will you just explain for us what the board has come up a bit in your evidence, the Board of Protection. Can you explain what its role was?
Well, the title is the board was established under the 1869 Act, so it was brought in then, and the title of the 1869 Act is an act to provide for the protection and management of the Aboriginal natives of Victoria. And arguably, in its beginnings, he did provide protection. I've read that present-day elders saying that if it wasn't for the missions and the reserves, we would have been wiped out totally. And for a little while, it did that. Look, it's a very complex story. I've got here an original copy of the 1877 Royal Commission I'll read the title page. Appointed to inquire into the present condition of the Aborigines of this colony and to advise as to the best means of caring for and dealing with them in the future. I got this on a rare book site, and it's an original copy of that. And that's probably the last commission of this sort in Victoria.
When that document refers to the colony, is that Victoria?
Yes, yes.
What year was that?
1877. And I think the evidence in it, I think has been very much overlooked. And there's a bit of a reason for that, it was probably published at the end of 1877 probably wasn't brought before Parliament until early 1878. And January 1878, I can't remember the actual date, but it became known as Black Wednesday because supply was blocked and the entire public service was sacked. So it kind of took the headlines. And then the Kelly Gang came on the scene in 1878, which kept the Royal Commission into the treatment of the Aborigines out of the headlines. And it kind of has never, I think it's because it actually, everything in that was in the 1886 Act is in complete contradiction to the recommendations of the Royal Commission. But I guess it has to be said that nothing's changed as far as Royal Commissions are concerned.
In terms of adopting recommendations
Yeah.
speedily?
Yep.
I just wanted to take you back to before I ask you just to explain the border protection, you make the point in your evidence earlier that what the Border Protection asked for and what came out in this legislation that Deakin was responsible for having drafted were two quite different things. And it is the point you're making, and to date there has been a lot of focus on the board's responsibility for those amendments. And are you suggesting that the board is not solely responsible for the contents, for asking for what ended up in that bill?
Yeah, I think the myth has always been that the 1886 Act was entirely be attributed to the wishes of the Border Protection. But as I pointed out, the Border Protection had no actual powers, and it's been a very handy scapegoat because the Border Protection are sort of, their names have been entirely forgotten, and it's sort of anonymous, and it's sort of, and that's sort of what, I mean, that's kind of what began me on this whole, that's the question that was in my head before I stumbled on this, was we've always all known about the police, or as it came out, as the story came out, and my first experience of it is in Archie Roach's song, Took the Children Away. That changed, that sitting at his feet at Port Fairy when I first heard him sing that song, I think in 1889, really changed my whole thinking, because, but he described the police and the welfare coming and taking him away. But the question in my head was always, hang on, the police and the welfare they're the employees of the state who come and do the dirty work, and many of them, I think it's fair to say, it hurt them doing it, but they had to carry out the law. But who made the law? That was what was in my head. Where did this start? And I didn't go into it in a sort of rigorous way. It was just in my head whenever I was reading, and I was thinking, where did this actually start? And everything, and then as I read further, it came to look like in fact, the book, I read a book in 2018. Some of the commissioners might know Mick Woiward's book, not Rebellion at Corranderk, the Black Hats, Barak versus the Black Hats. And in that, Mick Woiward writes, in December 1886, the government, under pressure from the Border Protection, passed the notorious, the infamous 1886 Act, which became known as the Half-Caste Act. Even in 2017, that was still the perception. It was all the Border Protection and the government. Deakin's name, in fact, in his foreword to that book, Mick Woiward lists Deakin as being one of the supporters, with Anne Bonn, Ephraim Zox, and others as being the supporters of Corranderk and the Indigenous population. And so he gets out of it completely. And then the very next book I read I was given the 2017 biography of, the most recent biography of Alfred Deakin, in which Judith Brett writes in a chapter on, she's just described how Deakin got up and spoke for 4 hours and to pass the Irrigation Act, which led to the establishment of Mildura. And then she says then Deakin's other significant legislative initiative in 1886 was to sponsor, she says, the Aborigines Protection Act. And that, the moment I read that and put all these other pieces that were in my head together, I knew everything had changed, and this would be, I didn't know the full story then, but I knew this was it. I thought, and she even went on to say this was the beginning of child abduction by the state. She didn't actually use the word stolen generation, but as soon as I read that, I thought, this is it. This is the beginning of the stolen generations. And although, and in Judith Brett's quote, Judith Brett's reference there, in her references, she quotes from Patrick Wolfe, who he actually writes, the 1886 Victorian Act marks the legislative onset of the Australia-wide policy of Aboriginal child abduction, coordinated in 1937, but administered individually by the separate states, the victims of which would come to be known as the stolen generations. Despite its ostensibly selective nature, the preferential targeting of lighter-skinned children, the policy was clearly aimed at the elimination of Aboriginal people as a whole. As Joseph Carradus, Secretary of the Federal Department of the Interior, observed the state delegates who assembled in Canberra in 1937 to devise a common Aboriginal policy, none of whom demurred, quote, "It would be desirable for us to deal first with the people of mixed blood. Ultimately, if history is repeated, the full bloods will become half-caste."
Can I just jump in here? Thanks for that, Peter. I'd like to ask Council if we can just have a 5-minute adjournment, if that's okay. Thank you. And we'll come back in 5 minutes. Thank you.
No, we don't have a witness.
When night's ready, sorry.
Our witness is missing.
Thank you, Chair. Peter, I wanted to go back and ask you some questions about the effect of the legislation, which, as you've indicated, has been referred to as the Half-Caste Act, and ask you to step through how the amendment specifically that Alfred Deakin was responsible for introducing resulted in children being taken away from their families.
Well, I'll have to dig into it to actually read it. But it's well known that it was carried out that way, and there is even evidence that there's evidence of welfare officers removing children who had both parents living because they said they knew that the intent of the act was to remove children from the influences. And there's some pretty I can't remember the actual quote, but it's in the very racist language of the time. I think it's also important to understand that in the 19th century, even in the non-Indigenous community, a child was deemed an orphan if it did not have a father, because women were seen as not being able to support children without a man in the family. And I think I first learned that in Claire Wright did a series on.
Might just stop you there, Peter.
It was Dora Montefiore, who was a Anyway.
I'll just stop you there because I wanted to ask you whether you have any understanding of what happened to those children that were removed. Has your research given you any idea of what happened with removed children, where they went, what happened to them?
They were taken away to orphanages, as I understand, many different, no, that's not something I've researched in particular, but I have heard, being a living, I think I've got this right. There are others who can correct me if I'm wrong, but that Geelong has one of the highest populations of stolen generations because there were 13 orphanages in Geelong.
Peter, can I ask you this? The act that you're speaking about is a notoriously racist act. And what you said is that you've got an ancestor who was closely connected with its passing. I just wondered what do you feel about that personally?
Well, first of all, I was horrified to know that he'd actually, when I first read it, even the way Judith Brett wrote it in the book, that he sponsored it, it sounded like, well, he was actually had the responsibility for passing it. But even in her, as I read her book, I was horrified. But then she writes a page where she kind of justifies it, why he did it, and that he didn't really have his heart in it. And the clue to me that gave it away to me was that she said he did it because he wasn't a fighter. He had no emotional capacity for a lost cause, however just. And by the time I'd read to the end of the book, I thought, hang on, that doesn't quite, something doesn't add up, because that's exactly what he did in the cause of federation. So I went back and started digging deeper. And what I now believe is that he did it. It was entirely intentional. All its content and its consequences were deliberate, intentional, carefully worded to be. There's a whole story in how he got it through the Parliament without alteration, without being amended.
Yes, but just back to Commissioner North's question really gets to, the impact on you of this discovery. How did it make you feel when you discovered that?
Well, I was horrified to start with, just that he had anything to do with it at all. Then that he hadn't sort of pushed against it, that seemed bad. But then I realised, then it just got worse, because suddenly I realised, oh no, he actually meant this. This was deliberate. And but as I've written, it did affect. It was hugely just, and I question whether I was right about it, because I'm not how come no one else had ever come on this? But
on that,
I've seen.
Was it difficult for you to find this information about his role introducing the amendments? Was it hard for you to find?
Actually, surprisingly not. And I actually got into Hansard, and I am really very inept with digital technology, but I managed to get straight into Hansard in 3 clicks, and there it was. And
but this information that you've told today about Deakin is not commonly known. Would you agree that it was really 3 clicks hiding in plain sight?
Yep. it's all on the public record. There is nothing in what I have found that is a family secret in family records that were hidden away in trunks under. Nobody knew about this. And in the research I've done, I would, unless evidence is produced to the contrary, from December the 16th, 1886, when it was reported in the Argus and the Age, to 1989, when Bain Atwood wrote about it, Deakin's name has never been publicly connected with this act. And yet everybody knew, well, particularly in the Indigenous community, the Half Caste Act was notorious for all that time.
Except it was known at the time. It's been easy to find the whole time. To an extent, it has been intentionally forgotten.
I think it was intentionally hidden. And I don't think it's been as easy to, I mean, prior to this, to get to that Hansard, you would have to make appointments with the Parliamentary Library and go in with white gloves to find the volume of Hansard to go and look at it. But historians did in pre-digital times. They did it, but they were professional historians. I wouldn't have known how to do it. But thanks to Trove and the technology, you can actually do it now.
Why is it important for non-Indigenous Victorians to look critically at their own family history?
Well, this is their national. This is I mean, I don't know. I mean, many families. I thought my family were all they came in the gold rush. They weren't part of the frontier massacres. This was the shock. I had no idea that this could have been possible. All the books I'd read had said that Deakin was a supporter of Aboriginal rights, but he was very clever at disguises and being able to do things under the cover of his reputation for high principles. And Judith Brett writes about that in her books, a wonderful description of his character.
You hope will come from the truth-telling process that you've participated in here in Victoria?
The recognition that this did not, to dispel the myth that the stolen generations came about out of bungled, mismanaged, but well-intentioned policies and acts that, yes, in hindsight, they appear that they were wrong and everything. No, this, as I heard Commissioner Hunter once speaking to Larissa Berendt on Speaking Out, she said, the system is not broken. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. And that's the truth. The 1886 Act was, as Patrick Wolf has said, its intention was the total elimination of Aboriginal culture and population. It's really important for Deakin in his longer term plan of white Australia. White Australia has always been perceived as being a result of the Immigration Restriction Act of keeping people out. But Deakin was very concerned that there would be an Indigenous non-white population. And it was really important also to show he had made various trips to London to deal with the colonial office and the British government leading up to Federation. And it was really important to him to be able to say, look, the numbers are always going down. And that's what he was thinking ahead. And the first step was taken in Victoria with the signing of the 1886 Act. He could just say overnight, well, not overnight, it was 7 years down the track, he could say the numbers are now half what they were and they're not going to go up. And he was, and he could convince the colonial office that was the case, and they'd look at the numbers, the board would count because they were no longer counted.
Commissioners, I didn't have any further questions. If any of the commissioners have questions.
Just want to reflect a little bit. You know, the thing that comes from me is I'm thinking about those children, especially the girls who are in their families, they're in reserves, they're under surveillance. Life is not good, but it's got some safety, and to be then just removed and, 15, 16 years old, just on your own, I breaks my heart to think about them. How many of them, I know that Welfare Act that you're talking about, the one that Welfare Royal Commission talked about people, Aboriginal people having to live on the outskirts of the towns and the girls in prostitution and other things. And it just, that was the real impact, I guess, talking all about the Act. I'm just thinking of the lives that people had to lead because of that.
Yeah, well, I think those stories are to be told by the descendants of those families, and they are being told and are recorded, and that's, in the end, there's evidence in the Royal Commission of 1887. There were witnesses who said it will not work. Absorption. Edward E.M. Kerr, who I'm sure is a familiar name, said, I could find the page and quote it, but he says absorption, he called it absorption, not assimilation, will not work. He said, and E.M. Kerr didn't muck around. He was a straight speaker, politically incorrect, but he said, absorption will not work. Try annihilation.
Those children, those girls especially, who were cast out from their families, by denoting them as not Aboriginal anymore, they just were forgotten. They became non-people.
And ended up in domestic training, where it was possible.
And
Can I just add on to that? And because I needed to understand that, because this Act is a very destructive, and it's just decimated our people, this Act. And so I just wanted to put a piece of the puzzle together, and you can agree with me if you like, that the 1886 Act enabled the expulsion of Aboriginal people of mixed descent, so the half castes, aged from the age 8 to 34 from the Aboriginal reserves. So if you were 8, and there possibly, it wouldn't surprise me if there was younger, and your family is full blood, or your parents, they get to stay on this reserve. And those children go to wherever. So then they're deemed, that is the start of the stolen generation. That is the start. And I just want to make the point that the devastation, that Act was so devastating and dehumanising for our people. And this is hard stuff, and I just want to thank you for coming and talking about this Act particularly, because it's just decimated our people. So thank you for coming and discussing it.
And the evidence is that because Victoria was sort of seen as politically progressive at the time, the Act, it was pretty easy for all the other states to say, oh, if Victoria can do that, we'll do it too. And they took it up. And it said, look, I haven't actually gone and got all of them and compared them, but I've read that the New South Wales Act is almost verbatim the Victorian Act.
And I think you're right there that they say that it started here in Victoria and went around. And I also don't have that legal nous or understanding of where and how that, but I just wanted to say that, this is one of the most devastating acts for our people, and it's pretty tough stuff. And again, I'll say to people, look after yourselves. particularly online or hearing it, and my fellow commissioners, this is hard stuff. And this is the stuff that continues to cause harm today, and it leads into today. So actually coming forward and researching your own family and carrying as well that burden of knowing that is a lot. So just wanted to thank you.
I think just to go on from what Commissioner North asked me about how it affected me, there came a time where I did move on from thinking this is, well, it wasn't a secret that had been kept it wasn't a family secret, it was there. I found it all in the public record, and that I'm absolutely certain that no one in my family knew this story, and I'm also certain that Deakin University didn't know it when it was founded. But what hit me, it wasn't long afterwards where I thought, I feel more shame about this as a citizen of this country who's grown up with all the benefits and the privileges and of this land, which has been invaded and taken, and then not just invaded and taken and subdued, but then an attempt to eliminate entirely the Indigenous population. And I've asked the question, is there another instance in human history where an invader has attempted, after invading an entire continent, to eliminate the entire Indigenous population? I don't think there has. I stand corrected if there is. So it was as a citizen that I've, because this has gone. Why was it not questioned? Why were we? I mean, even when I heard Archie Roach's story, I thought, what? He's young. He's younger than me. This is happening in Victoria. Why is this still going on? Because it's obviously not working. You know, it's not even achieving whatever it was meant to be. What was it? What was it about? And it was, the horror was when I discovered what it really was about. It, you know, I mean, it was clear. And I think we have to, all of us who are non-Indigenous have to, it's a collective responsibility. Nobody looked at it. As Edward Kerr says in the 1877 Royal Commission, he says, the fact is we have pretended but never really wished to save them from extermination. And I think we're still pretending. He goes on to say some other pretty brutal things, probably not that are hard-hitting facts. I think but I think he was a straight speaker in many ways. He was a flawed individual, but he saw it as it was, I think, and described it as it was.
Okay.
I just want to say thanks for coming in today. I've been pretty quiet today. Normally I do ask a lot of questions, but just really reflecting on my own family and my aunties and uncles who were stolen from their lands, and which many of them have now passed, and put in these orphanages and treated horribly wrong. So just thank you for coming forward and sharing your family's history, and encouraging also other people to come forward and engage in Yoorrook's processes or truth telling more broadly as well. But I'm just sitting at peace with thinking about my family right now, and just thinking about all the stuff that they went through, and also our people more broadly as well. I think it's really, as Commissioner Hunter said, it's a massive day, brings up a lot for us as a people, and as well, the system is working perfectly as it was designed to do as well. So just, thanks very much for coming forward.
Can I just respond to that to say again, I want to emphasise this is not my family's history. it's actually this state's history and this nation's history. It's not a hidden away. It's not this is Deakin as a public figure, elected in a democracy, and Parliament voted on it. This is a collective history, not a family history. It didn't.
Yeah, shall we adjourn until 2 p.m?
Yes, thank you. This commission is now adjourned until 2 o'clock. Thank you. This sitting of the Yoorrook Justice Commission has now resumed.
Thank you, Chair. We now have the evidence of Dr. Katrina Kell. Katrina, could you please introduce yourself to the Commission?
My name's Katrina Kell, and I am a descendant of Captain James Liddell, who's captain of the Henty family to Gunditjmara Country in 1834.
Can I just check? Is your microphone?
No, it's not.
That's good.
There's a green button.
It's on. I can see the logo.
Okay, mate.
Did you want to move it a bit forward? Just
Yeah, because I'm very, very quiet, so I'll just bring it a bit closer. Is that better?
Yeah, that's much better. Thank you.
Would you like me to repeat that? Or is that okay?
If you would like to, that'd be great.
Okay. So my name's Katrina Kell, and I'm a descendant of Captain James Liddell, and he was the captain of the Thistle that took the Henty family to Portland in Gunditjmara Country in 1834, where they stole land and set up farming. I'm from Warrigal Country in Western Australia, and that's where I live and work. And so I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to share these stories today from my family.
And I know Commissioner Hunter welcomed us to her country this morning, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to acknowledge country in your own words.
So I would like to acknowledge that the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation are the traditional owners and custodians of the unceded lands where we meet today. And I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. I also pay my respects to First Nations people who may be present today, in particular Gunditjmara people. And I acknowledge the invasive and illegal theft of Gunditjmara land that commenced in 1834, theft which my colonial ancestor helped to facilitate. I also pay tribute to your courage, resilience, and commitment in protecting your rightful lands, culture, and law, and your continuing quest for the truth, reparation, and justice. I would also like to note that there are names of deceased persons mentioned in my submission. The deceased persons' names have been included for evidence and historical accuracy, and I am sincerely sorry for any hurt or offence this may cause to First Nations people. And I would also like to thank Commissioner Hunter for her welcome to country this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina. Do you undertake to tell the truth to the Yoorrook Justice Commission today? Thank you. You've prepared a submission for the Commission dated the 17th of August 2024 with 6 attachments, that's right? That's already been tendered, Chair, this morning. Your submission focuses on your descent from or being a descendant of Captain James Donaldson Liddell, who, as you mentioned, was the captain of the Thistle, which brought the Henty brothers to Gunditjmara Country, where they took up land illegally. If I can just bring up figure 1 of your submission. So that's a painting of the Thistle by artist Jack L. Koski that's included in your submission. You mentioned that you're a descendant of James Liddell. How did you discover that connection?
Through the family. So we were told from when we were very young about Captain Liddell, and that he was the captain of the ship that took, in the family's stories, it was the first plough, not only to Victoria but to Australia. So there's, quite a few inaccuracies in the family stories, but that was what we were raised on, and there was a great deal of pride in this story. Just for information, I was actually born in Scotland, but my grandmother was Australian, and that's where this family line goes back to the 1820s.
And your submission is very thorough regarding the history of James Liddell, and you've done a lot of research into his background and his relationship with the Hentys in particular. Could you please tell the commissioners a little bit about James Liddell's background and how he came to Australia?
Yes, well, he was quite young when he came out here. He was only, I think, about probably 20 or 21 when he came out here, and he had come from Alloa in Scotland. He was a Scotsman, and initially he was working on ships up and down the sort of New South Wales coast. And at the time he started working for the Hentys was probably just a few years, probably around about 1829 and 1830. And at that time he was working for the Hentys on the Thistle, going backwards and forwards between Launceston and the Swan River colony. And it was on one of those journeys that he claims to have identified that the soil in Portland Bay would be ideal for farming. And he claims to have been the one that actually identified that. So, so he was a young sea captain, mariner.
And the Swan River colony, is that in Western Australia?
Yes, that's correct.
So you're actually living quite close to
Yes.
situation where your ancestor would have travelled.
Oh, most definitely. And he was very much involved with the First Nations people there as well. There's other stories which don't relate to what we're talking about today, but have a lot of significance there as well. Yeah.
And you've mentioned his involvement in calling into Portland Bay during those travels, and you've highlighted a number of the historical evidence from his own journals and memoranda in regards to calling into Portland Bay between Launceston and the Swan River colony. Can you explain a bit more about what you've found out in your research about his responsibility for the Henty brothers arriving in Portland Bay?
Very much that he was aware that they were unhappy with the conditions in Western Australia, in the Swan River colony. They felt the land there was not suitable for farming. They'd also been left one of the sons in Albany, and so he was also in and out of that area as well. I think they felt it was a bit more favourable there, but they were still very much on the lookout for somewhere else to set up their merino farming. And depending on which account you believe, he claims he sort of called into Portland Bay. And there's two accounts. One is that he identified himself that the land there was suitable, and that he dug up a clod of earth and took it back to Launceston, where he showed the father, Thomas Henty, this soil. And I think there's other accounts where one of the Hentys claims he was the one who dug up the sod of soil and took it back when he was actually in the company of Liddell. But Liddell claims it was when he was on his own. None of the Hentys were with him. And he also had spoken to William Dutton at the time, and he had recommended that this would be a good place for farming as well. So I don't know if that is a familiar story, but that's what I have discovered. And I think that's probably the closest to the truth. Yeah.
And there's a reason why, as you highlight in your submission, there's a reason why the Hentys were looking to move out of Launceston as well, to move out of Tasmania. Can you just explain to the commissioners why that was the case?
Well, that was due to the fact that they weren't able to get land free, basically, anymore. They were going to have to pay for it, yes. So they were looking for other opportunities. And yeah.
The land grants had been exhausted.
Exactly, that's
correct. Was then Van Diemen's land.
That's right, yes.
So if you wanted to get land, you had to buy
You
it.
just had to buy it or steal it.
And so it seems that they went down the latter route at Portland. And you mentioned William Dutton. So as I understand it, around the time that James Liddell was calling at Portland Bay, a number of whalers, including William Dutton, had commenced whaling on Gunditjmara Country. What was the nature of their activities as you know it at around that time in the early 1830s?
Well, they were catching the southern right whales, from what I understand, and there was also a lot of sealing as well, which I don't think Dutton was so much involved with that. But Liddell most certainly was, my ancestor, and he was dropping off whale boats and crews of sealers at all the different islands where they were harvesting seals. And then he also felt that there would be good opportunities for whaling in Portland Bay. And I think it's very difficult to confirm categorically whether the Hentys were actually whaling at that time, but it certainly looks like they were as well at around that time, around 1833, 34. There was certainly evidence that that was happening, was starting to happen. Yeah.
And there's some indication in your research that suggests that whaling was particularly important at that time because of gaining the oil from the tongues of whales, and so that was a common practice at the time in terms of
Definitely, yeah, the tonguing, yes, and there would be a lot of the work would be done on the beaches, and that was very much the case in Albany as well, in Western Australia. So they would boil up the tongues and everything, extract the oil. And it was quite lucrative. It was extremely lucrative. And the sealing was starting to slow down by this stage because they had harvested so much, the local populations, which also had a huge impact on, local Indigenous people as well. One of the things that I found most disturbing about my ancestor's involvement with the sealing was that he would have absolutely been aware of the theft of Aboriginal women. Who were taken to the islands and used as slaves, and various other, prostitution and things, not prostitution, just sex slaves. So, to know that he was aware of that and dropping off these crews, picking them up, sits very uncomfortably with me, that knowledge.
The context of whaling on Gunditjmara Country is very important context for what we now know as the Convincing Ground massacre. We've heard evidence about that massacre before the Commission and commenced our evidence on land injustice at that very important sacred site. What's your, without having to go into detail, but just for everyone listening to this evidence, what's your understanding about what happened at what was called by Europeans as Convincing Ground?
I think, based on what I've discovered, I think it was to do with the whale and the fact that there was a whale had come ashore. And there was conflict between the whalers who were there, who believed it was their property, whereas the Gunditjmara people there, there'd been some sort of discussion, from what I can understand, that if they were on the beach, they belonged to the Gunditjmara. And so there was a disagreement, and there was a skirmish, and there was some spears thrown, and then the whalers all ran off and got guns and started killing the Gunditjmara people who were there. And it was a particular clan. And apparently there were only 2 survivors. And that's my understanding of what happened there. What I also discovered is it's been very hard to identify when this actually occurred. And based on things I've recently learned, I think so the Hentys and my ancestor may have actually been there at this point, but we can't say for sure, but the dates all align. And there's things in Liddell's memoranda that his daughter shared that raised some very concerning questions about that particular visit to Portland Bay, and which I can go into more detail if you need. Yeah.
Yes, and so in fact your submission is quite thorough in terms of looking at some of the dates we understand from primary documents that James Liddell and the Hentys would have been in and around Portland Bay. And I think I'm right in thinking that would have been around from mid-1833 to mid-1834.
Definitely, yes, yes.
And in terms of our understanding of when the Convincing Ground massacre occurred, it's generally understood that that might have occurred at around the same time. Am I right in saying that?
Yes, yes, that seems to be the period from what I've read, that they believe that's when that happened. And if you look at some of the accounts in Robinson's diaries and records, that certainly appears to be the case, because there's different accounts have been given by various people. Some of the accounts say that the disagreement, what led to the massacre, was the theft of Aboriginal women. But I personally think it was probably a combination, and also the whale was hugely significant. Yeah.
And you mentioned briefly about James Liddell's potential knowledge or proximity to the events in some way. What has your research uncovered, or what conclusions or hypotheses have you reached about his potential knowledge or proximity to the massacre?
Yeah. So in his daughter's letter that she wrote to the newspaper, where she shared and directly quoted from his memoranda, he talks about having visited with the father, Thomas Henty, and there was, I think, another brother there as well, one of the Hentys. And he was saying how initially it's about how he had, Thomas Henty had said he thought the soil there did look good. So that kind of confirms Liddell's claim that he was the one that identified it. And then he talks about how they'd been he'd picked up whaleboats and crews from various islands. But the really interesting revelation is that they were apparently supposed to leave 2 whaleboats at Portland Bay. And this is out of Liddell's mouth. This is his words. And then he said, but we didn't leave them, and I can't remember why. And as soon as I saw that, I can't remember why, this is a man that kept very meticulous records. You would remember why you didn't leave whaleboats, if that's what the plan was. And obviously it reveals that they were going to be whaling. And the other thing is, my thoughts and my theories are, there's a couple of theories. They either witnessed the massacre, may have been involved with the massacre, or didn't want to be associated with it. So therefore remove whaleboats and take them away, so there's no question that they were part of it. So these are just theories, but certainly could be the case.
So eventually the Hentys moved permanently to Portland Bay and erected buildings and brought livestock on the Thistle, and you've mentioned that James Liddell would have been responsible for a lot of those passages in terms of as master of the Thistle. And in your research, you found a newspaper article in the Hamilton Spectator, which was essentially an argument between William Dutton and James Liddell on behalf of the Hentys about who was the oldest colonist in Victoria. If we could go to attachment 6 of the submission, which is behind tab 7, Commissioners. So you can see the title of the article regarding who is the oldest colonist, and then it follows that statutory declarations were provided to the paper from both William Dutton and James Liddell about who built buildings and was living there permanently first. I just wanted to get a sense of your reaction as to what that dispute tells us about the attitudes at the time, particularly about First Peoples' ownership and relationship to the land.
Tells us everything, doesn't it? You know, there was just not one mention of the original owners of the land. And that's something that has continued right up until very recently. I was talking to someone recently about a publication of the Henty Journals that was published in 1996, and in the dust jacket it talks about the Hentys and how they set up these wonderful farming principles in Portland. It talks about the new land, that this was a new land. It talks about how the southern right whales were decimated as a consequence of whaling in that region. There is not one mention of the First Nations people from that area. That was in the 1990s, published by the University of Melbourne in conjunction with another publisher. So, I mean, this is nothing, there's no surprises really. It's just, that was just the attitude that prevailed, that, you know, basically, yeah, let's pretend there was no one there. Let's pretend these people never existed. Let's pretend there was no culture. It was inconvenient. It was an inconvenient obstacle to taking over someone else's land, someone else's country.
And Commissioners, just apologies for your benefit, it's page 150 of the Almanac, which is on 0037 of the stamped copy. So it's essentially the last 4 pages of the document. And without going into detail about the various the 2 statutory declarations, they read as extremely competitive, essentially, about who owns the title as the so-called oldest colonist. What do you make of, or what's your reaction to the fact that there was even a dispute about who was the first colonist on the country?
Well, I think it's just apparent that, you know, that it was just this desire to conquer, to conquest, to claim ownership of the land. And I think, you know, it just seemed, to me, it seems very petty, to be quite honest. The arguments is when you're talking about such a significant thing, you know, where there's been these terrible things happening to the original owners of the land, and yet there's not one mention of them. And then these people all arguing over who was the first, you know, it was all about trying to become someone important in terms of history. I think that's what it was. And even to this day, I think there's still question marks between these, you know, whether it was Dutton or whether it was the Hentys. But yeah, it's trying to really establish dynasties, essentially. Yeah.
A quite dark story that you've already alluded to regarding what's been uncovered in your research is that it's likely that James Liddell also ferried who you've referred to as William Hutton's Aboriginal slave and so-called wife, Kalungu, between Portland and King Island. I know we have it in your submission, but to the extent that you feel comfortable, what do you know about that particular story?
Well, I have been able to confirm that it was him. I did quite a bit of further research. He was captain of the Thistle on that particular voyage. Dutton took over the captaincy of the Thistle on the return voyage back to Portland for a period when Liddell was on leave. He had a new baby and obviously was taking time out in Launceston. So yes, he did, for want of a better word, ferry Kalungu and drop her off at King Island. And she was separated from her child. What I'm not sure about was whether the separation of the child occurred on that particular occasion, but I suspect it probably did, because Kalungu was then taken to, not Kalungu, her daughter Sophia was taken to Launceston, and I've recently discovered she was actually raised within the Griffiths family initially, but was probably more working as a servant for a lot of that time. So yeah, that's a horrible story to have discovered, to know that he was involved with that, and, you know, obviously carried out the orders to do this, based on an early historian who I don't have my name at my fingertips, but there was an account that that was something that the Hentys actually wanted to happen. They didn't approve of this relationship between Dutton and Kalungu, and wanted her removed. And it's in the Henty diaries. There is actually an entry in the Henty diaries about that particular incident happening. So there is evidence of that. So it did occur. I think latterly, Tony Wright discovered that, based on his research, I think Kalungu ended up somewhere quite different to King Island when she was, you know, according to her record accounts as well, which she shared with Robinson latterly. Yes, there's a lot of evidence about that particular chapter, and it's very sad, because it was essentially, once again, it was a stolen child story, where she had her child removed from her.
And I think is it Joe Wiltshire that is the historian that put together some of that material from the Henty diary?
I'm not sure if it was Wiltshire, but it was, yeah. You've highlighted that a number of those, a number of materials and primary sources indicate how Kalungu was mistreated in that period. What does that tell us about the attitude towards Aboriginal women at that time? Oh, it tells us everything. And she was originally abducted from her own country and taken to Kangaroo Island as a child, where she witnessed some terrible things and probably, well, almost certainly would have experienced terrible things. And then she was bought. My understanding is she was bought by Dutton, and he took her back to Portland Bay. And some call her his wife, but essentially she was his slave. And she claims he mistreated her terribly and would beat her and things like that. So she didn't have a good life with Dutton at all. And then she had a child with him, as we know, which he removed from her.
Clearly a focus of your submission is on the relationship between James Liddell and the Hentys, Thomas and his son. You've conducted some research about, in particular, George Robinson's reflections on the Hentys from his journals. What do you know about the Hentys who your ancestor would have known quite closely from your research into George Robinson's journals?
Yes, well, he would have known them very well. He wouldn't have just have known them. He worked for them for many years, and in between journeys, he would actually stay in Portland for quite lengthy periods of time. So that's obvious. He would have known what was happening. And Hentys, in their own words and what they actually told Robinson, they basically viewed the Indigenous people, the people from that region, as barely human. Apologies for these terms, but this is what they actually said. He claimed, and Robinson actually said that if people weren't supportive of their attitudes towards the Indigenous people, they would basically not have been accepted in that area. There was a code of silence, and Henty even said if someone, raised a spear to him, he would shoot them on the spot, even if the noose was right next to his head. And they were talking in terms of, it was just common practice to be shooting the Indigenous people in that area. There's lots of accounts in those journals about that. And so, if Liddell was as close to them as we know he was, he must have known about that. And yeah.
And you highlight that even Robinson, upon Edward Henty saying to him that the local traditional owners had not visited the settlement at the bay for some years, Robinson's assessment of Henty's revelation was that in this they are wise. So it indicates that Robinson's making that assessment of that it's a wise thing to stay away from.
Absolutely, yeah. He was horrified, and he said that he got a very cold welcome from the Hentys. And he said that, it was obvious anyone who had any concerns for the Indigenous people there would not be welcome. They would not be welcome because there were obviously things happening there that shouldn't have happened. And the fact no one came near there is pretty telling, isn't it, after what happened at the convincing ground.
And as we've heard multiple times in evidence, even the fact it was called convincing ground.
Yes, yeah, it is.
Of intent.
The interesting thing in the Henty diaries is they quite often refer to the convincing ground, but there's never any context. It's just the convincing ground. But they don't. So once again, it's another exclusion. It's another hiding of something they were fully aware of. Yeah.
Given what you've said about what James Liddell must have known, given the closeness of the relationship, how do you think that reflects on him and his legacy?
Very badly. Very badly. Because, I can't think of how you could say anything else. I think it really does mar his legacy. Seriously, because, even if he didn't actively participate in any of these atrocities and what were essentially genocidal activities, I feel you're just as guilty if you're just there and you're aware it's happening and just let it happen and don't intervene. But he may well have participated in some of this. I don't know. One of the things in Janet Liddell's letter was that he was always extremely reticent about talking about those days. He didn't want to talk about the early days. So that indicates a hiding, I think, things that perhaps happened that he did not want to talk about or share or discuss, and probably, hopefully, had an element of shame about, or whether it was just this code of silence to continue on with this taking over of other people's land. Yeah.
Talking about that issue of shame, you've described directly in your submission your connection to James Liddell as inherited shame. What do you mean by that?
I mean, we like to take a pride in our families, don't we, and their achievements. And I think it is an inherited shame, because part of the shame is, even through our family stories, is the fact that we didn't learn anything about this. We were never told anything about this. So there's been this sort of intergenerational denial, not passing down what has happened, what the truth is. And that's why I feel if you once you reach a point of understanding and that you do realise what has happened in the past, you have a huge responsibility to share that story and get that truth out there. So it is an inherited shame. Yeah. And it's even more shameful if I have this knowledge now and I don't talk about it. Mm.
And you mentioned at the start of your evidence about, learning about James Liddell in terms of a sense of pride, of family pride in that connection. I know this might be an overly philosophical question, but do you have any reflections on how that type of narrative gets constructed in terms of how we think about family history compared to when you dig deeper, like you have, and you find a different truth? Why do you think that significant disconnect often happens?
I think I can give quite a specific example within my family because of the other side of that relationship of James Liddell. He married a convict ancestor, and I've only just very recently discovered my great-great-great-grandmother, Abby Desmond. Now, we as a family knew nothing about this woman, absolutely nothing about her. So she had to change her name. She was never known by her true name after she married Liddell. So there was a huge amount of shame over this convict ancestor. And so by elevating the sea captain's story, gave the family this point of pride, I guess, at a time when having a convict ancestor was considered very shameful. Also, the family, certainly my side of the family, were quite working class. They didn't go on and acquire lots of property or do anything like that. My great-grandmother, she married an Englishman, and so the family was then taken back to England, and they were quite impoverished and quite dire circumstances a lot of the time. So I think this sea captain in the family was a point of trying to sound like, well, we've got something to be proud of here. So I think there is that element in families, if they're feeling a bit downtrodden or whatever, sort of try and find somewhere in family history that you can be proud of. And then when eventually you discover, oh, hang on a minute, not much to be proud of there, really. It's pretty sad.
Mention that sense of responsibility to share the truth once you've known it. How do you go about fulfilling that responsibility? What do you feel like you need to do based on that sense of responsibility?
Talk about it. I'm a writer, so if there's ways within my work I can write about it and talk about it in a way that's culturally safe and sensitive for Aboriginal people and First Nations people, that's what I would hope to do. I have done a little bit of that already in various ways, but always in consultation with First Nations people before I do that. And I think that's the way to go about things. So I think getting those stories out there, talking to people, sharing what I know as much as possible. I've spoken to my family at length as well. And fortunately, every member I've spoken to is just very keen to share the truth. I have one family member I'm not quite sure, I haven't spoken to yet, and not sure what his reaction is going to be, but that's okay. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. I think some of the older members of the family who have passed would probably have struggled. But I know my great-grandmother, there's another story in there about her positive relationship that she developed in Australia with a gentleman who we might talk about in a minute. Yeah, which is a nice positive story that we've got there.
Yes, and in fact, that was exactly where I was going to go. Clearly the history of interaction between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Victorians is a complicated one. And you mentioned in your submission that your great-grandmother, Barney Barber, had a friendship with an Aboriginal man called King Billy. It's a little bit about that story.
Well, this has been a very beloved family story, actually, that was passed down from my great-grandmother to her daughter, and then to my mother, and then to me and the rest of the family. And Barney Barber was actually Winifred Mabel Barber, but she was a tomboy and she was a very outgoing sort of Aussie girl. And she, when she was only about 9 or 10, was befriended by a gentleman called King Billy. And King Billy, it turns out, was, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his name, but it was Willem Barnip, who came from around the Geelong region. And I had to do quite a bit of sort of date checking to try and confirm whether it was him. And because my great-grandmother was living in Queenscliff at this time, and he went to Queenscliff to the racetrack and had spent time in Queenscliff around the time that she claims that she knew him. And he used to, from what I understand, he used to love sharing traditional knowledge and trying to keep culture alive. And he taught Barney how to cook rabbits in the traditional way. And she said how he would coat the rabbits in mud or clay and bake them over the coals and then remove the hide and the skin. And she had very fond memories of this relationship. And apparently he was staying, as they put it, on their property, but it would have been somewhere they were living at the time for some time. He actually stayed there. So that was our story about her positive experience.
And you've actually found some historical material that refers to him. And apologies to the operators, I'm doing this without notice. But if we can go to attachment 5 to the annexure, it's NUT.0001.0921.0029. Sorry, it should be attachment 4. And if we can just focus on the first paragraph on the left column, this is tab 5 for the commissioners. And there's a paragraph that you've found in the Queenscliff Sentinel, which is equal parts entertaining and disturbing. One of the last of a line of kings who used to be monarchs of all they surveyed between Geelong and Colac. Notice the past tense. Used to be. King Billy arrived from Geelong on Wednesday last so as to grace the Queenscliff racecourse with his presence. His Royal Highness travelled in cog and barefoot. What's your reaction to reading that about King Billy? And this is 1884. What does it tell us about the attitudes of the day?
So patronising, isn't it? It's just, it's horrible the way they sort of describe him. And, very disrespectful. I think it struck me, it seemed very disrespectful and almost making a joke out of him. And clearly he was a very well-respected and honoured man within his own people. And certainly the story that was passed down by my great-grandmother is that's how she remembered him too. She had a great deal of affection and respect for him. So, but that's not unusual, sadly. That is how I've various times come across some horrible newspaper articles describing Indigenous people. And even when I was doing my PhD, because I was looking at sort of the experience of people from around Lake Conda, and came across a newspaper article where it was describing two motorcyclists who had come across a travelling family who were on. They were actually had left the mission and were walking because they preferred to be away from the mission because they didn't like it. And the way they described these people, the father and his wife and the daughters, was horrible, the language they used. But yet, in between all that, the wife of the matriarch of this family challenged these men, these motorcyclists, and she actually said they told her where they'd been, and she said, "Do you know that is?" She gave a name. That's so and so's country. That's our country. You should be paying rent up there and things like that. So it was this really feisty, strong woman who really, she really challenged them. And that was back in the very early 20th century that article came out. So interesting, very interesting. Yeah.
In terms of those stories about James Liddell, about your great grandmother, Barney Barber, about all of the various things that those relationships tell us, or that history tells us, how do you grapple with reconciling those stories as a descendant in terms of both the dark and the light, if I can put it that way, or the darker or lighter elements of our histories? How do you, as a descendant, grapple with that?
Grapple's a good word, actually. It is something I have to grapple with a lot. And I think it basically tells a story of our family, because, I mean, it's like a lot of families. There's a lot of stories that you are told for reasons, and there's others that you are not told for reasons. And I think we have to probably, particularly in Victoria here, but also around Australia, we have to look at all those stories. And I think as people, and for myself personally, the only way I can grapple with it is to face it and accept it, feel that sense of shame and disappointment. I think disappointment's a huge part of it. Very disappointed to discover this about my ancestors. But at the same time, thinking about what can I do now to try and make a difference, if that's possible. Yeah.
And you said a little earlier, in terms of what you do now with that story, you made the point that you want to do so in consultation with First Peoples affected by those stories when you think about telling those stories or sharing those truths. Why is that important to you?
Well, it's just the right thing to do. I mean, it's essential. I mean, how can you tell any story if you're just telling it from one side? And it's respectful, because, I mean, my ancestors have not been impacted particularly in any way by this story, whereas people from Portland region, Gunditjmara people, and I'm sure there's probably other First Nations people too as well, have been impacted. So, of course, the first thing you have to do is speak and seek consultation and discussion and feel how people feel about it. You know, it's not just my ancestors' story. It's more importantly, it's First Nations people's story. And I think there's a lot of sort of information now available to help people to do that in a way that is culturally safe and sensitive. I don't think anyone has the right to just barge in and tell other people's stories. I mean, I've got my story, but my story is so interconnected with your story.
I can go to, if you have your submission in front of you, if you go to the last page of the submission, in terms of the conclusion. So if we can bring that up, it's the last page of the submission. Could you please read out that final paragraph to the commissioners?
Yes, sure. Researching and critically analysing my ancestors' role in facilitating the theft of Gunditjmara land and the abhorrent treatment of Aboriginal people in southwestern Victoria has been confronting but also cathartic. I believe all non-Indigenous Australians must face this nation's violent past with honest and critical eyes. We must contribute to the truth-telling process and ensure there is justice and reparation for all First Nations peoples by acknowledging the crimes committed by our colonial ancestors. It is also vital that the truth about Australia's frontier wars is included in the Australian curriculum and fully recognised and honoured at the Australian War Memorial.
Why do you think it is important for all non-Indigenous Australians to face the nation's violent past with honest and critical eyes, in your words?
Because that is who we are. That is what this nation is. And if non-Indigenous Australians aren't prepared to accept that, we will never, ever be mature as a nation or be an equitable nation or a nation that can feel proud of itself. While these stories are hidden and not shared and the truth is denied, how can you call yourself a nation in this day and age? It's, it's just vital. It's absolutely vital. And it has to start very, very young. It needs to be there right from as soon as young children are able to understand in a way that they can actually absorb that information. They need to know that's the history of this land and that we are only new here on Indigenous Australians. We've only been here for just over a couple of 100 years, and this is the world's oldest living culture. So that's something to be extremely proud of. And, if we want to be able to hold our heads high and be part of that story, we need to own up and face what's really happened here. And I don't think that's really been done very well up until this point. So this truth-telling process is a wonderful way of beginning that, and hopefully that will spread around the whole of Australia. Yeah.
And just reflecting on a question that Commissioner Lovett asked earlier today, to people that would say, well, let's just leave the past in the past, whatever it might be. Why is understanding the events of the past important for today, and also the impact of those events on the impact that those events continue to happen, continue to have on our country and particularly our First Peoples?
Yeah, and I think that's why they're still continuing, is because if you just leave things in the past, it's like the only way I can sort of really, it's a very crude way of describing it, it's just like having a boil that's just getting bigger and bigger and full of horrible things that are just going to cause more and more problems. And unless you lance that boil and give it a chance to clear and clean and get the truth out there, out in the open, give it some oxygen so that people can face it, accept it, and make the changes that are absolutely necessary for First Nations people to be able to flourish in their own lands. Otherwise, nothing will change. Nothing will change. And I think we've just been a nation that just does that, just likes to pretend all these things haven't happened. And it's time for that to change.
And a part of that change, as you see it, that you recognise in your conclusion, is to change the Australian curriculum, in particular around learning the truth of Australia's frontier wars. What kind of changes in the curriculum would you like to see happen?
I think if you bring First Nations people into that right from the get-go, so it's they're actually designing that curriculum and making sure that it is telling things from your perspective, and at the moment, there's a lot of information in the school curriculum about culture, about Aboriginal culture, art, those sort of things, but there's very little about the frontier wars. And there's wonderful ways that can be done. I did a beautiful project some years ago in Western Australia with Wajak Noongar elder Trevor Wally and Ashley Collard, who's a Noongar artist. And it was called Our Story Islands. And we got quite a bit of pushback from for the school, but it was a special arts project, and we took the students to Wajimuk, Rottnest Island. We took the year 6s and 7s over there, and they normally used to take them over for a snorkeling expedition, but we took them to the Quad, and that is where so many Aboriginal men from all around Western Australia were taken, and many, many died in horrible circumstances. And we showed them the conditions that these men were kept in, told them the stories of what had happened there. These children went away and they wrote stories about what they'd learnt. They were so moved and open, their hearts were open. They wanted to know more. They just wanted to learn more. And with the younger kids, Trevor and Ashley did a lot of beautiful work with art and culture and sharing stories about animals and everything. And it was just that beautiful engagement. And if we could see that happening, all around the country, I think you'd see a much more rapid change. And like I say, it was a challenging project because there were a lot of the teachers were not happy. But we sort of pushed through, and yeah.
And did some of those teachers see the worth in that type of?
Some did, yeah, definitely. Yeah, absolutely.
But just some final questions from me, just to foreshadow in case the commissioners have any of their own. What inspired you personally to provide your submission to the Yoorrook Justice Commission and to appear to give evidence before the commissioners?
I have to be honest, it was Commissioner. Yeah, love it. I saw your article in The Guardian, and when I was reading it, I could see the links between my family history and what had happened to your people. And so I reached out, and that's how it all began. I wasn't sure how I would be received, but I was very grateful that you were open to hearing about my family history and what being the possibility of sharing some truths that might be helpful in some way. Yeah.
And what would you say to other non-Aboriginal people, particularly people with connections to Victoria or who are in Victoria, to encourage them to explore their family histories and the history of the land they are connected to in order to uncover its Indigenous history, as confronting as those discoveries might be?
I think to not be afraid and to accept, history is what it is, just accept there could be things that you will discover that you're not happy about, that you're disappointed to learn that your ancestors have been involved with, but to think about it as a duty of care to First Nations people and to this country and to this nation, and making it an honest nation that you can actually feel proud of. Because it's very hard to feel proud of Australia a lot of the time because of this history and the fact that it hasn't been addressed. I was born in Scotland, but I feel very much Australian because of my family heritage, and I'd like to feel a lot more pride. And not just to see tokenistic sort of band-aids being applied right, left and centre, real genuine digging deep and not to be afraid of doing that. See it as a very important part of being an Australian. Yeah, that's my thoughts on it.
Commissioners, those were my questions, if you have any questions.
I asked this question of Susanna Henty when she came and provided evidence here as well. So is there anything further or anything you'd like to say to Gunditjmara people in the audience here, but also listening in, that you'd like to share with them here right now?
Yeah, I would just like to say how sorry I am, deeply, genuinely sorry, that this is something that this loss of land, this theft of land that you've experienced, the genocide, the terrible atrocities that have been inflicted on you, and that my ancestor was clearly aware of that and very likely a part of that. I really am very sorry and would never have wished that on you. You know, I just, and I would like to do whatever I can to make a difference.
Lord.
No further questions from me. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Katrina. Very thoughtful presentation, very full and very open and honest. Thank you so much for that. I like that you refer also to the lack of the history of this country in the curriculum. This is one of the problems. There's no opportunity for learning through schooling. And also the point about the War Memorial. You know, we're expected to share Australia Day, and yet we're excluded from where our people went and fought for this country. You know, there's such anomalies in the thinking of white Australia. So thank you for your presentation.
And one other thing, just in relation to King Billy, he's actually got ties to Gunditjmara Country. King Billy they're referring to from Geelong is actually originally from Gunditjmara Country.
Interesting.
One of our apical ancestors. Yep.
Close off then. I'd just like to thank you all. Thank you all for being here today, and also thank all three witnesses for the interesting and full contribution that you've made. Very hard to hear some of it, but it's not new to us. It's just sad that we have this continuing story. But I hope that people understand who are watching and listening and here today that there's still an opportunity to take part in truth-telling. We need to have all Victorians come forward and share the burden of this truth-telling, if that's possible. But I thank everybody that's come before us so far, and I thank the people that are watching today. I also welcome the way in which everybody spoke today openly and frankly to us, and I like the idea that you seem to feel reasonably comfortable before us. I think that's really important that people know that. Yoorrook is still taking submissions, and so, as I just said, we invite all Victorians to come forward and share their truths. So I now declare the... Oh, Sue-Ann, do you want to say that?
Yeah, just a reminder for people to look after themselves after hearing today's evidence, which was hard to hear. So if you're affected by the content, would like to support, so please contact 13 on 139276 or Lifeline on 13 11 14.
I close the session of the Yoorrook Justice Commission. Thank you. Thank you, Council.
Thank you, Chair.